Chapter 221. Jason. Earlier, Jason had grown sick of tasting his own blood, but he couldn't help it. Biting his cheek was a habit he'd inadvertently picked up over the last couple of months. By now, it had grown a little out of hand. He'd already chosen to ignore multiple calls from Deimos, afraid his boss might order him to return to the guild. Of course, not answering was a serious offense in and of itself, but he could still play dumb later. Defying a direct order, on the other hand, wasn't something he'd be able to downplay as easily. "I really hope this is the one," he grimaced as he continued to follow the latest trail. Eventually, a large wooden mansion faintly appeared on the horizon, drawing his attention, and the two karmic threads were pointing straight towards it. A noble house? It has to be one, right? This was certainly more promising than the shitty towns and fields the last couple of threads had led him to. On second thought, it wasn't that surprising. He'd already exhausted more than half of the trails, so he just had to be getting closer to Nesha. Well, unless she's also dead. One possibility he hadn't given as much thought to was one where the alchemist had murdered both of his accomplices, Percy and Nesha. Should that be the case, the threads extending out of her clothes might never lead him to his target. "I suppose there's no sense in worrying about that. If that's the case, I'm screwed anyway." He shrugged. What province was this again? Camelot or Sentin? Getting a little closer, he managed to make the insignia out, carved on several spots along the outer walls. It depicted two faces, looking away from one another. Digging through his memories, he tried to recall which families had a similar symbol. Briareus, Cottus, Avalon. Jason froze in his tracks upon thinking of that last possibility. Avalon, as in Percival Avalon. Tededrunt. No, that couldn't be the case. Why would Nesha or the alchemist visit the family of their dead collaborator? Merely avoiding their own families wouldn't have been that strange. After all, Nesha's house was already destroyed. The alchemist might not want to stay at a conspicuous location either. But there were so many alternatives to choose from if they just wanted to divert attention. Why pick Percy's house? The only possibility that made sense was that the boy was still alive. Why would they even keep him around? Did they grow fond of him? Or maybe the alchemist was a relative of his to start with. Jason's heart skipped a beat as countless possibilities swirled within his mind. He still had no idea what to make of this mess. But it didn't really matter. The odds of having finally stumbled upon something important had just shot through the roof. Taking out the device, he was about to activate it, though he hesitated. If he contacted Deimos now, there was no going back. His superior was bound to lash out at him over his failures, and the missed calls. All would be forgiven if his current lead yielded a result, of course. But if not, it's not like I have a choice. I doubt I'll get another chance anyway. If this one is a dead end, I'm screwed. It's best to know what I'm dealing with. Making his mind up, he opened the watch, pouring his mana into it. He barely had to wait a moment before the other side picked the call up. "Jason!" a furious voice yelled, barely a second later. "If you ignore one more of my calls, I swear I'm going to skin you alive. How dare you disappear for weeks on end?" Having expected the outburst, Jason had already leaned away from the device, though the sheer fury contained therein still caused him to flinch. "Deimos, just shut up and listen. None of that matters. I think I've got some real results this time," he hurriedly said, before his boss had a chance to interrupt him again. Deimos remained silent for a few seconds, letting his words sink in. When he next spoke, he did so far more calmly, some cautious optimism inadvertently spilling into his voice. "If you're lying to me, I'll give you exactly one chance to reconsider," he grumbled through gritted teeth. "Look, I can't be 100% sure, okay? But I'm confident in this one. The thread has led me to House Avalon." Jason doubled down. "Can you check if there's anyone else in the guild from that family? Besides the Redborn, the narrative has been taken without permission. Report any sightings." Deimos hung up without saying anything. It wasn't until about an hour later that he called Jason again. "Nobody. House Avalon hasn't sent anybody else here in decades. I see. Well, Nesha has to be around, otherwise her clothes wouldn't have brought me here. Percy has to be too, as nothing else makes sense. I don't know if the alchemist is with them, but I'll make them spill his whereabouts out regardless. Activating his karmic vision, Jason saw the threads were already on the move. He wasn't deterred in the slightest, however, his lips only parting into a grin. The fact that they'd chosen to run away as soon as he arrived could only mean that he was correct. Run then, as far as you can. You won't escape this time. He could chase after them right away, though he'd rather speak to the family's leader first to gauge the house's stance on the culprits. It was the Divine Roots protocol to do so in cases like this, to not give their adversaries a chance to come up with believable excuses. I've missed doing my job properly so damn much. As for his targets, they were no longer of any concern. He'd only need a couple hours to catch up to them, now that he'd singled out the correct threads. Resting one leg over the other, he leaned back, sinking into the couch. This was the first time he was able to relax in years. Ignoring the hushed whispers of the local nobles, he patiently waited for the violet to arrive. "Forgive me for the delay," a bald man said, stepping into the hall. "You've chosen a rather strange day to visit. You see, we're expecting the emissary of the Divine Order to arrive." "Oh? Is that today?" Jason raised an eyebrow. So long had he been on the move, he hadn't even registered the passage of time. Not that he was particularly concerned with the lotus. The petals weren't even compatible with his affinity. "You must be Archibald, then?" he asked again with a shrug after not getting a reply to his last question. The man nodded, before speaking. "I won't presume to know what matter was important enough to bring the divine root to our doorsteps, but I'll do my best to entertain you." "Really now?" Jason asked nonchalantly. "Why do I have this sneaking suspicion you know exactly what I'm here for?" Archibald remained silent, however. "Fine. I'll play along. I'm looking for Nesha Veritas and Percival of your house. I know they were here just minutes ago, so don't even try to pretend otherwise. I'm sure at least one of your relatives will crumble under the slightest bit of pressure," Jason said, gesturing at the other nobles. "Did you come into my home to threaten me, boy?" the powerful Violet hissed. At the same time, a suffocating domain descended upon Jason, pressing him into the pillows. The latter's smile only widened, however. He could sense the old man was holding back a great deal. No way his domain was weaker than Deimos's. Naturally, he just didn't dare harm a single hair on his head. And they both knew it. Threatening you isn't quite as serious a crime as inhibiting the Divine Root's official investigation. Or would you like to personally explain to the gods of the Divine Order why everyone on Remir is still drinking the regular elixirs, after all this time? The man's features softened as he withdrew his domain. The fury in his face all but evaporated, replaced by some unconcealed concern. "What does that have to do with anything? Do you deny the two people I've mentioned were here? Or that they came here from the Alchemists' Guild?" Archibald appeared to ponder the questions for a few seconds. "I do not. It's true my grandson used to be in the guild. He left our house years ago of his own accord, after we denied him the elixirs he needed for his growth. A rather common story on Remir, is it not? You do know the guild has been on lockdown since Hermes' message, right?" "Naturally. Percy claimed he'd left months before the incident. You can't really blame me for believing him either. Are you telling me a young lowborn like him somehow got involved in such a grand matter? Or that he managed to slip through the guild's perimeter without anybody finding him for years?" Jason could smell something fishy going on. Archibald's words made sense, but he couldn't shake the impression the man had intentionally delayed meeting with him, buying time for his grandson to escape. "Well, if either of them knew of my affinity, they wouldn't have counted on that." He struggled to suppress a smirk. For now, his best bet was to get the man to implicate himself further. "What about the girl? Didn't you question where your grandson picked her up? Also, was there a third person with them?" Archibald furrowed his brow, appearing to seriously ponder the questions. "It was just the two of them. Of course I asked Percy about his girlfriend. Our house is in the middle of a war right now. We can't let outsiders join willy-nilly. Honestly, I didn't even know she was a noble. They both showed up in filthy rags, claiming she was a commoner he'd met in some town. You understand how serious the repercussions will be if you're lying to me, right? Jason asked. Do you take me for a fool? I've lived dozens of times longer than you, boy. Archibald stared him in the eyes, completely unfazed. If he was lying, he was good at it. This is the first I'm hearing of my grandson's involvement in this matter. House Avalon had nothing to do with this. We'll fully cooperate with your investigation. Glancing around at his relatives, Archibald then raised his voice for all to hear. From now on, Percy is excommunicated from the family, until such time as the divine root determines his innocence. If he tries to contact any of you, you are to arrest him on sight and deliver him straight to me. His girlfriend, too. Jason shrugged. This hadn't been particularly helpful. Guilty or not, the old fox clearly knew to say all the right words. Either way, it didn't matter. The fate of House Avalon was something for his superiors to decide. His only remaining responsibility was to capture the culprits. Then, he could finally wash his hands of this nonsense. Leaving the mansion, he activated his ocular technique once more, pinpointing the conspicuous threads he'd identified earlier. They'd already traveled a few degrees to the north, probably varying their paths to ditch him. A bunch of fools. Such tactics might have worked on anybody else but not him. Against a Karma user, their best bet had been to escape in a straight line, prioritizing distance above all else. Not that it would have made much of a difference, though. At most, it would have bought them another hour or two. Cracking his neck, he sped after them, eager to finally get his hands on the bastards that had screwed with him for so long. Chapter 222. Diplomacy 1. Percy dragged Nesha through the whistling woods, the two sprinting in the darkness. The moonless sky wasn't doing them any favors as they struggled to avoid crashing into a tree. Plus, they were out of breath already. Still, he ignored the exhaustion, striving to buy as much time as possible as he contemplated their situation. Several scenarios flashed through his tired mind, each worse than the previous one. Naturally, he was under no delusions that they would escape without a confrontation this time. If their enemies had managed to track them all the way here, they clearly possessed some magical means of locating them. Perhaps a specialized bloodline or an artifact. Percy had no idea what it was exactly, but it didn't really matter. The only thing they could control was how to react once they were found. Then again, he couldn't exactly decide on the best course of action either. Not without knowing what they were up against. If the root had sent any blues after them, they were already out of luck. His training sessions with Galahad had made that abundantly clear. His only hope was that it would be overkill. Surely, even the divine root couldn't afford to have their blues roaming Remir for years on end, looking for them. It's not like we'll have a much easier time against their greens, though. He smiled bitterly. Unlike their carefully prepared ambush in Bogside Town, he wasn't in any condition to fight at that level right now. They hadn't set any traps up, not to mention that he currently lacked the majority of his constructs. In fact, he was glad he'd even had the presence of mind to grab his two scythes before rushing out of the mansion, so that he wouldn't be entirely unarmed. His companions weren't faring much better either. Nesha had dark bags under her eyes. A healing potion would help with that, but there was only so much she could do with a single spell in her arsenal. As for Mickey, he was doing worse than either of them. The crow had already met up with them and was currently flying in their vicinity. Still, Percy wouldn't even let his familiar fight a yellow right now, let alone a green. Also, these people are likely to be elites among elites, even stronger than the likes of Rambert or Mordred. Worse still was the fact that he couldn't just run away. Even if he could come up with a way to ditch his pursuers, he didn't only have himself to worry about. While he was certainly glad they'd managed to evade discovery for so long, this was arguably one of the worst possible moments for them to be found, smoked right out of his family's mansion. If he failed to handle this properly, his loved ones could easily pay the price. "Stop!" he muttered, pulling Nesha to a halt. The girl acquiesced, though she did flash him a questioning look. We'll have to confront them at some point, whether in a fight or through diplomacy. Either way, I'd rather not be out of breath when it happens. Nodding, she accompanied him to a nearby tree, the two of them sitting by its roots. Mickey landed some distance away too. Next, the trio proceeded to go over various possibilities, discussing how to deal with each of them, all the while keeping their senses out for any intruders. Well, who do we have here? A snarky voice pierced through the cacophony of the whistling cones. I was wondering why the two of you had stopped moving. Did you get tired? Or did you actually think you'd traveled far enough to ditch me? Percy failed to see the newcomer's face, having put his blindfold back on while waiting for him. He'd take it off if he had to, obviously, but the situation hadn't devolved that far. Just one green. He noted, not finding anybody else. It wasn't going to be an easy fight, given their current state. Still, it was about the best they could have hoped for. Then again, he'd rather try something else before falling back to violence. Who are you? Nesha was the first to speak. No, I've already done the playing dumb routine once today. Don't even bother wasting more of my time. Not after my life up for the last 2 years. The green replied, his voice devoid of humor. Right now, your best bet is to tell me who brewed the Aurora Dew and where I can find him. Trust me, you don't want to play games with me. The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement. That can be arranged, Percy said calmly. Before that, I also want a couple of reassurances from you. Or better yet, from your boss. The green chuckled. Do you honestly think you're in a position to be making demands? He snarled. If you wanted to negotiate, you should have done so 2 years ago. Ignoring the quip, Percy tossed him a gemstone vial, a turquoise liquid swirling inside. It's me. I'm the one you're looking for. I know it's a little late, but 2 years aren't that long in the grand scheme of things. I'll share the recipe with everyone, and we'll all get our happy ending. Do you have any way to contact your boss? We'll gladly accompany you to the nearest town if you need to send a letter. A wave of amusement rippled through the green's soul. You? Do you seriously expect me to believe that crap? Do you see anybody else with us? Or do you think we pulled the Aurora Dew out of thin air? Nesha asked. How could he have possibly succeeded where every alchemist on Remir has failed? For thousands of years, at that. The green didn't relent. It's simple, really. I looked where nobody else did. It's all thanks to my bloodline. I trust you don't have the patience for my life story. Do you? Percy fired back. Wouldn't you rather pass the responsibility of assessing the validity of our claims to your superior? Nesha pitched in with a question of her own. The man appeared to ponder their request for a few seconds. Fine. I'll play along. We've already been in this ridiculous dance for years. I suppose a few more minutes won't change anything. Taking something out of his pocket, he drew some mana from his core, pouring it into the object. A series of runes that Percy failed to identify soon lit up on the device, though he was more focused on the man's strange mana type than the item. What affinity is that? I've never seen this one before. Is this how he was able to find us? On one hand, it was rather troublesome. Escaping would be impossible as long as this person drew breath. Conversely, it also meant the solution to their problem was standing right in front of them. Oblivious to his thoughts, the man continued pouring mana into the device for a few seconds, until the rest of the inscriptions lit up. Jason? Any updates? The voice was a little difficult to make out. Between the whistling trees and the fact that Jason was standing over 100 feet away, the quality was terrible. Still, both Nesha and Percy had advanced a few times, their hearing significantly better than Ared's. Boss, I've caught up to the culprits. They haven't made any attempt to resist so far. Is the alchemist with them? What of Archibald? The old man played dumb. I have no idea if he was actually involved with them. As to your first question, no. It's just Nesha and Percy here. Percy claims he's the mastermind behind the elixirs. A loud sardonic laughter rang through the device. Please tell me you haven't bought that nonsense. Naturally not. But they said they're willing to come peacefully as long as they can get some assurances from you. I figured I'd let you make the decision. They can hear you. Very well. Percy, was it? Have you any idea of the kind of mess you and your companions have created? How about you stop playing games with the fate of our world and just spill the beans already? With all due respect, sir, the Aurora Dew is a recipe of my creation. If you, or anybody else wants it, you should ask for it nicely. What gives you the right to make demands, threats, or snarky comments? Jason swallowed hard. Hard enough for Percy to hear. You insolent piece of shit. The man's voice boomed through the artifact, causing the inscriptions to flicker violently. Your grandpa wouldn't dare speak to me this way, let alone a trashy Redborn, still wet behind the ears. Yeah, well, my grandpa doesn't have the recipe you want. I do. I'm sure you can have your boy kill us, cripple us, or whatever else, but trust me, the easiest way for you to get what you want is to play nicely. Or would you risk me dying and taking the recipe down with me? Can you even prove your ridiculous claim? You can't seriously expect me to believe that crap just based on your word alone. Percy shrugged. The primary ingredient for the Aurora Dew are the regular elixirs. The next step is to add a mystery ingredient that massively accelerates a core's recovery. That's what allows the Aurora Dew to be consumed 3 times as often. Finally, rainbow grass is the only secondary ingredient I found that is suitable to deattune the Aurora Dew a second time. It has to be mixed at a much higher temperature too. I'm guessing your alchemists have already figured much of that out by themselves. I'm also willing to bet you're still missing the most important ingredient. Am I wrong? The man remained silent for a minute or two, seemingly digesting the information. At some point, Jason felt the need to interject. Boss, I forgot to mention that they also have some Aurora Dew on them. I still find all this a little far-fetched, but these are the facts. Well? Percy asked, pressing the man for an answer. I admit that you've crafted quite the story there. Still, you don't need to be an alchemist to know all that. The real culprit could have told you and given you a few doses to turn you into a scapegoat. Frankly, I've no idea why you'd sacrifice your own future for somebody else, but I've seen people do dumber things before. Percy failed to suppress a chuckle. So what? Even if that was true, I could still tell you what the last ingredient is. And even if I don't know it, I'm still your best hope of catching this imaginary alchemist. Either way, it's in your best interest that we come willingly. Or are you so petty that you'd sabotage your entire mission just to hurt us? Very well. What assurances do you want from me exactly? Chapter 223. Diplomacy. 2. To start with, I need your word that nobody will harm me or Nesha. That's not really up to me, is it? The man asked back. I can promise you the divine root won't mistreat you as long as you cooperate, but I can't speak for the divine order. The gods do as they please, and you've kept them waiting for way too long. Truth be told, Percy had expected a response along those lines. Still, that didn't mean he would accept it. Not good enough. If you can't even guarantee our safety, why the hell would we risk our lives to come quietly? Relay the request to the ones above, if you need to, and get back to us. We'll wait. Jason's superior didn't reply immediately, seemingly considering it. My name is Deimos. The man sighed eventually. Hermes is actually my father. It's going to be a tough ask on my part, but I think I can get him to agree to your terms with some pleading. Deimos sounded sincere, but Percy didn't miss Nesha's core flaring slightly by the corner of his eye, specifically upon hearing the second half of the man's statement. This was the signal they'd agreed upon. He's lying. Not necessarily about being Hermes' son. That part seemed truthful. Rather, it was his ability to plead for leniency on their behalf that appeared somewhat dubious. But why would Deimos do something this dumb? Surely, he knew about Nesha's bloodline by now. Is he gambling on it not working properly through the device? Well, does that suffice? Deimos asked again, oblivious to the fact that they were already onto him. Honestly, I thought you'd want me to go easy on your family too. Do you not care about them? You bastards. Percy spat without a moment's hesitation. Why do you think I was forced to leave for the guild in the first place? If it hadn't been for those stingy bastards, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Ha 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 ha. Ruthless. I'm starting to like you, kid. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. If your and Nesh's safety is all you want, I suppose we can let bygones be bygone. No, Percy said, interrupting Deimos. I never said this was everything. 50 doses of elixir every single day. For the rest of my life. Promise me that, and I'll follow Jason back to the guild right this instant. Jason drew a sharp breath upon hearing that, his flickering soul betraying his inner turmoil. Deimos fell silent too, seemingly taken aback by the outlandish request. Not for very long, though. Have you lost your damn mind? The man erupted. Not really. Percy shrugged, unfazed by their reactions. You know damn well we were able to earn way more than that on our own. For months on end. With virtually no backing, and while having to keep our heads low. The recipe is easily worth thousands of times as much, if not millions. Don't tell me the Divine Order can't afford it. Whether they can afford it is beside the point. These are holy existences we're talking about. The ones who keep our world safe. On principle, we can't just have any random mortal extorting us. Let alone a red-born runt. What kind of precedent would this set? How about a precedent that you are generous enough to properly encourage and reward magical breakthroughs? That you respect those capable and creative enough to revolutionize magic as we know it? Percy insisted. If you can't even see that, you're just a bunch of short-sighted fools. This book's true home is on another platform. Check it out there for the real experience. Kid, save your breath. Deimos eventually sighed. I'm not the one you need to convince. Terms like these would have been difficult to accept even if you'd negotiated with us properly 2 years ago. Let alone after we've backed you to a corner. I'm aware. Why do you think I chose to ran away in the first place? But these are my terms. Take it or leave it. Seeing the negotiations rapidly going south, Percy started taking one deep breath after another, filling his channels with mana. Their adversaries didn't pick up on that. However, as Deimos offered a compromise a few seconds later, here's what we can do. I'm willing to give you 1/5 of what you asked, out of my own pocket. I couldn't afford a copper more than that, even if I wanted to. Percy had to suppress a chuckle after seeing Nesh's core flare up more times than there were words in Deimos' statement. Outwardly, Percy showed no sign of seeing through his facade, however. Instead, he kept his thoughts to himself, to let his enemies believe he was seriously considering their counteroffer. At the same time, he continued building his reserves up, feeling his boosting art take effect. Deimos might be under the impression that he was deceiving Percy, but the opposite was equally true. After all, Percy had never really expected them to agree to his demands, nor had he any intention of letting Jason go. Not after guessing he was the one responsible for locating them. But, while Deimos' goal had been to trick them into surrendering peacefully, Percy was aiming for something entirely different. I just hoped this was enough. Contrary to what he'd told Deimos, he did care about his family. Very much so, in fact. But he couldn't let them know that, to spare his relatives from their wrath. And then there was Orin. Percy had to convince Deimos that he was solely responsible for the Aurora Dew, to give his mentor some plausible deniability. Of course, he didn't really know what had happened to the old alchemist, but he assumed he was still alive and well. If not, the Divine Root would have already learned the recipe. That said, things would change now that they'd discovered the extent of Percy's involvement. It wasn't a huge secret that Orin had mentored him. I see how it is, Deimos said, having seemingly picked up on something, after seeing Percy remain silent for too long. Jason, break all their limbs and drag them both to the guild. Just make sure to keep them alive. Roger that, Jason replied a little too eagerly. Though his boss hadn't even waited for that, the runes on the artifact already dim. Go, Percy whispered, having discussed this with Nesha beforehand. Be careful, she replied, bolting off. Percy didn't spare her another glance, turning his attention to Jason as the glowing lines lit up on his body, one after another. His muscles tensed too, his skin reddening as synchronization fully activated. But he didn't stop there. Grabbing the flask strung by his waist, cleaving its lid off with a hastily crafted construct. Without a moment's hesitation, he gulped its contents down with one swift motion, not having the luxury to complain about the potion's peculiar flavor stinging his tongue and throat both. Truth be told, Percy hadn't thought he'd have to resort to his latest creation mere days after brewing it. Still, he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. As risky as it was, he knew his companions would only slow him down right now. And there was no other way to hold his own against the likes of Jason without his armor. "Please work," he pleaded as a rush of burning mana spread out of his stomach, swiftly enveloping his flesh. Within seconds, his blood began to boil, as his veins bulged and squirmed along his skin, painting a stark contrast against the glowing lines brought about by his boosting art. His muscles swelled even more than before, some blood inevitably oozing out of his body as his skin tore in several spots, having stretched beyond its limits. The blood didn't trickle down either. Instead, it bubbled and frothed by the wounds, traces of crimson joining the teal fog leaking out of his pores. Percy winced, feeling his body tearing itself from within. But he couldn't afford to dwell on the pain, pulling his blindfold off just in time to see Jason sprinting towards him. A lot of that weird mana was gushing out of the man's sternum too, as he was already preparing his own magic. Percy's heart skipped a beat at the sight, though that might have more to do with his racing pulse than fear. At least the bastard is ignoring Nesha for now. He couldn't help but grin. It was another key goal during their previous negotiations, to make himself important enough so that his enemies would focus on him first. Not that it would matter much if he ended up dying. With a subtle wave, he called upon the invisible pair of scythes propped up against a nearby tree, drawing them to his hands. Percy was perfectly aware that he'd be at a severe disadvantage as soon as the potion expired. If losing its help wasn't enough to do him in, its severe side effects might. And his already short window to act would continue to shrink with every passing second. 15 minutes. Tops. I have to make sure he's dead by then. Chapter 224. Troll's Fury Potion. 3 orbs of mana rapidly flew towards Percy, each a separate color. Do they all do different things? Or is that just how this weird mana type looks? Suffice to say, he hadn't the slightest idea what would happen if he got hit. But it didn't really matter. Whatever it was, he couldn't afford to let a green spell touch him. Certainly not without his armor. Somehow, he'd have to dodge every single attack. Leaping out of the way, he evaded the bolts. The red and blue ones were the easiest, being a little farther away, though he did nearly get glanced by the yellow one. If it hadn't been for the potion drawing even more strength out of his body, the battle would have ended already, though such power wasn't without its cost. Steadying his footing, Percy ignored his aching muscles. He did the same with his heart thrumming against his chest, or the violent storm rolling within every vein. Even the tiniest movement placed a huge strain on him, but he couldn't help it. He needed to use every advantage he could to stand a chance. His eyes fell back on Jason, who was already about to launch his next attack, when a series of cracking sounds came from behind him. It was as if somebody was digging at a dried patch of dirt with an oversized shovel. Unable to turn around, he observed the situation with his mana sense instead. 3 blobs of green mana were attached to the ground, swiftly pulling it towards him, trying to rip it from the earth. What the hell is this? Percy didn't get the chance to dwell on it for long, however, as Jason sent a few more bolts after him, forcing him to sidestep again. The same scenario repeated itself too. Wherever the mana landed, it stuck to the ground, slowly pulling it up. Suddenly, Jason grinned, his cold smile sending a chill down Percy's spine. At the same time, his core flared up, a large amount of mana disappearing from within. Percy raised an eyebrow, unable to guess what his opponent was up to. While his greater foresight still warned him of the mana's trajectory, it remained completely silent about its effects. Not that strange, considering he had no understanding of this affinity whatsoever. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, he got his answer soon enough. The chunks of dirt were torn out with even greater force, flying towards Percy. Sidestepping them wasn't that difficult, but that was just the start of his troubles. They didn't fly very far before slowing down, eventually coming to a halt mid-air, a few dozen meters away. Next, they snapped back at him like stretched rubber bands, seemingly determined to hit him. How is he doing this? Percy wondered, as Jason resumed sending orbs of mana at him too, trying to overwhelm him. It was a well-known fact that greens had greater control over their mana, not to mention a top talent like Jason. Still, the way he seemed to individually command so many disjoint objects simultaneously was quite bizarre, to say the least. Unless he isn't, are they chasing me on their own? Struggling to avoid over a dozen objects shooting at him from every direction, Percy decided to go on the defensive, until he knew what he was dealing with. Putting some distance from Jason, he zigged and zagged through the trees, using them as cover while trying to figure out what his opponent was doing. The patches of dirt continued to rain at him, though plenty of them crashed against the trees, exploding into dust clouds. Still, that didn't seem to deter them in the slightest, as the loose pebbles resumed their flight towards him the very next second, stubbornly homing into him. Yeah, no way he's controlling over 100 objects separately. He's definitely enchanted them to do this by themselves. The only question is, how? Either way, a pebble or two wouldn't do too much damage if they hit him, but they would still distract him enough to possibly spell his doom. Percy had no choice but to keep running through the woods, all the while trying to decipher the inner workings of Jason's strange affinity. At some point, Percy noticed something rather peculiar. Glancing behind him, he saw a series of small craters, lining up into a trail, and, thinking back, this was exactly the path he'd just taken over the last couple of minutes. The tail has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. He seems to go out of his way to only target the spots I've stepped on. Is that a requirement for them to chase me? An idea flashed through his mind. Pretending he was about to land in a certain location, Percy tried to bait Jason into launching another projectile towards him. It worked like a charm too. Twisting his body mid-air, Percy avoided the bolt while ensuring he never set foot on that spot. Watching the orange bolt sink into the ground, Percy's lips curled upwards after seeing it remain still several seconds later. Apparently, Jason's spell worked by tapping into some invisible connection between himself and objects he'd previously touched, sending them after him. This must be related to the way he tracked us down, he thought, though his smile soon turned into a grimace. This doesn't really help me, does it? I can't just stop touching things. The more projectiles Jason shot at him, the more Percy was forced to dodge. That, in turn, meant he'd step on more places, giving Jason even more ammunition. A vicious cycle, especially so, considering that the man appeared to conserve his mana quite well. He was never going to run out at this rate, and Percy couldn't possibly escape either. Not to mention, shit, I can't afford to waste any more time. The potion won't last much longer. Percy's greatest problem was that he still didn't completely understand Jason's affinity. Approaching him before his eyes fully adapted to his attacks would be suicidal. Yet, delaying wasn't an option either. Making his mind up, Percy pushed even more mana into his channels, taking advantage of the potion's effect to overload synchronization further. A reckless move, seeing how much trouble he already had keeping his body together. Ugh! Percy let out a pained groan, his knee nearly buckling as he dodged another bolt at an awkward angle. But he didn't pay that any heed, focused on flooding his body with even more raw power. His muscles pressed his organs inwards, as his joints threatened to come apart every time they bent or stretched. The cuts along his skin widened too, rivers of blood soaking his clothes. The life mana desperately tried to close them, of course, but it couldn't possibly keep up with the damage. Knowing he'd only run out of time even faster this way, Percy gritted his teeth, rushing back towards his opponent. More projectiles flew at him, some magical, some mundane. He dodged whatever he could, while batting the rest into dust with his scythe's shaft. Picking up speed, he ran towards his prey with determination, his eyes locked onto Jason's. The green mage raised an eyebrow at that sight, though he didn't appear particularly worried. Drawing more mana from his core, he tuned his own assault up to 11, trying to stop Percy in his tracks. He did so by launching even more colorful bolts, one after the other. The objects he'd previously enchanted seemed to grow quicker too. Sending them after me costs mana. Percy already knew that, but that wasn't everything. He can speed them up, but that consumes even more. Parrying the pebbles got harder and harder as the number of objects stabbing at him increased. At some point, Percy had to start ignoring the smaller ones, enduring the pain as many of them pierced into his skin, drawing even more blood. Another realization soon hit him. However, there are fewer of them than there should be. By now, Jason had unleashed hundreds of projectiles at him, each having collided against something several times already. Had they all kept chasing him, he would have long drowned into an avalanche of dirt and rock. Smashing another stone into fragments, Percy paid closer attention to them, as well as his opponent's core. Jason's expenditure instantly flared up, the green glow soon dimming from many of the smaller shards. The more objects he controls, the faster they sap at his mana. As obscure as Jason's affinity was, it clearly operated within strict rules and under certain limits. The man couldn't keep all the objects enchanted indefinitely, or his core would be dried out in seconds. He had to constantly decide which of the objects would help him the most, letting go of the least useful ones. Suddenly, a narrow shard sharp as a knife pierced through Percy's eye. Yet it did no damage. It wasn't a real stone, just a projection, brought about by his greater foresight. At last, his spell had begun to affect the mundane projectiles too, his understanding of the affinity having climbed to a new level. Resuming his advance, Percy allowed shadows of the grim dance to mix with the rest, estimating the results of his own movements. This allowed him to gauge which attacks he should evade, and which he was better off parrying. His scythe spun soundlessly through the air, materializing only when they were about to land on a piece of stone, shattering it into sand. His steps grew more elegant too, as he strode forward, pivoting, hopping, and weaving with greater confidence than ever before. Jason couldn't help but frown upon seeing him close the distance between them, though he didn't seem particularly worried just yet. "Let's see how much longer you can keep your composure," Percy smiled coldly, before hurling the first of his scythes at him with next to no warning. He kept the second to defend himself, but that didn't mean this was all he had to attack with. By now, he'd accumulated a ton of fused mana, a thick shroud of teal with hints of crimson enveloping his body. Grabbing a chunk of it with his free hand, he flicked it at his opponent, sending a rain of throwing stars right behind the Soul Harvester. Jason's lips curled upwards, however, as he stood in the same spot, showing no intention of moving an inch, up until the very moment the projectiles were right upon him. Chapter 225, Shroud. With a wave of his hand, Jason released a colossal amount of mana in front of him, covering all of Percy's projectiles like a blanket. At first, both the scythe and the throwing stars continued to stab at him, though they slowed down rapidly. Mere inches before tearing into his pupil, the Soul Harvester came to a complete halt, the rest of the constructs following. The hell? The weirdest thing was that Percy's mana had been in its incorporeal state the whole time. Whatever Jason's affinity was, it could interact with soul mana directly. Not something Percy encountered very often. The last time had been nearly 2 years ago against that time mage. Oblivious to his thoughts, Jason poured more mana into Percy's spells. Soon, he overcame the willpower embedded within them, pushing them back. Slowly at first, they traveled in reverse, steadily picking up speed as they flew towards Percy. He tried to dodge, of course, but his opponent showed no intention of making things easy for him. Jason sent the enchanted objects after Percy, surrounding him from every direction, cutting off his escape routes. Shit! I can't block everything. Out of options, Percy used his one remaining scythe to crush as many chunks of dirt as he could, gritting his teeth as he let the smaller ones hit him. At the same time, he willed his own constructs to shatter, moments before they stabbed into his soul. The throwing stars turned into wisps of smoke, joining the rest of the fused mana around his body. Jason let go of them too, probably minding his expenditure. The good news was that Percy could now recycle the mana into a new round of projectiles. Sadly, the same couldn't be said about his scythe. With a heavy heart, he destroyed the corrupted soul harvester, his expression souring as a wave of teal powder showered him. Alas, it was preferable to having his soul cleaved in half. And by his own spell, no less. Now I'm one weapon down, and I can't even hit him. Whatever I throw at him, he'll just send back. Jason wouldn't wait for him to figure things out, however. Pressing upon his advantage, he resumed his onslaught, sending more colorful bolts after Percy. His joints protested as he strove to dodge them all. Unlike the enchanted objects, Percy couldn't let the foreign mana touch his weapon, or he'd lose it too. And things continued going downhill, as the bolts landed on the ground, bringing more patches of dirt to life, sending them after him. At some point, Percy dodged a large chunk of rock, mostly by accident, his knees buckling as he coughed out a mouthful of blood. His channels also felt more saturated than before, even though the same amount of mana was coursing through them. Evidently, neither his body nor the potion's effect were going to last much longer. I need to do something, and I need to do it fast. It was easier said than done, however. Jason was different from the other greens he'd faced in the past. Not much stronger necessarily, but certainly calmer, colder, more calculating. His moves weren't as flashy as the others, but his entire fighting style was surgically designed for him to maintain the upper hand. The way he chose which objects to enchant or let go of ensured his mana expenditure was minimal. His ability to deflect attacks thrown at him was arguably the perfect defense. His homing attacks weren't as damaging, but they were troublesome to handle. And to top it all off, it was impossible to escape from him, the ultimate tracker. His entire kit seemed to revolve around slowly and safely wearing his opponents down. Thinking back, Percy had only achieved a single minor victory against Jason since the start of the battle. Specifically, when he managed to retrieve the fused mana Jason had redirected towards him. Jason had probably consumed more mana to commandeer each of Percy's constructs than Percy himself had spent creating them. Can I scale that interaction up? He wondered, raising an eyebrow at the thought. Capitalizing on his singular advantage was common sense, but there were several problems with that idea. To start, his mantle of deceit had never really been much of a finisher, not since he began fighting greens. Whether in their corporeal or ethereal state, the small constructs wouldn't do much damage against a strong opponent. This was one of the main reasons why he had developed the Soul Harvester to begin with. Then again, he'd never had access to nearly as much fused mana as he did right now. As a side effect of the potion and his supercharged boosting art, Percy had a ridiculous amount of teal smoke surrounding his body. Stolen content warning. This tale belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences elsewhere. Maybe it can work. I just need to figure out how to make the most of it. A few more colorful bolts flew towards Percy, seemingly about to hit him. Unlike before, however, he wasn't as quick to dodge, doing something else instead. Grabbing a handful of teal mana, he shaped it into just as many throwing stars as there were bolts. Next, he relied on the projections afforded to him by greater foresight to accurately estimate the trajectory of Jason's attacks before throwing a projectile at each one. Percy couldn't help but crack a smile upon seeing the colorful mana sink into his constructs. The projectiles themselves didn't seem to be affected in the slightest, however, flying into the distance. Percy tried to call them back, to retrieve his mana, though Jason had clearly learned from his previous mistake. Rather than return towards Percy, the throwing stars flew away even faster, soon falling outside his reach. Ok. So, he can tap into a connection both ways, to repel or to attract two objects from one another. Still, this was a positive result, all things considered. Even though he had lost some of his mana, it had probably cost Jason more. It must have, to override Percy's control over his own spell. More importantly, Percy had prevented Jason from enchanting more patches of dirt, leaving him with fewer objects to send after him. Grinning, Percy stopped moving around. Using his scythe, He crushed the last chunks of dirt, as he continued to intercept all of Jason's spells with his own. At the same time, he accumulated more mana, preparing his counterattack. Let's see how you deal with this one. Perhaps 1 or 2 throwing stars wouldn't do much against a green. Even a couple dozen might not be enough. But what about 100? With a wave of his hand, Percy unleashed nearly half of his fused mana, sending a rain of projectiles at Jason. Furthermore, he varied their trajectories slightly, making them close into his opponent from a wide range of angles. Remaining calm, Jason released a lot of mana, stopping the throwing stars in their tracks. Due to their spread, it cost him more than it would have otherwise. He repelled whatever he could into the distance, though he was still forced to send a few back at Percy, letting him recover a fraction of his mana. Percy wasn't deterred, continuing to push his body to its limits, pumping out as much mana as he could, trying to recover any dregs he could from his surroundings. By the time the throwing stars returned, he was ready to launch a second barrage. And then a third after a similar situation played out. The only thing different from one wave to the next was the number of projectiles, as well as their size and spread. Carefully scanning both Jason's mana reserves and his reactions, Percy fine-tuned his attacks to maximize his opponent's consumption, while minimizing his own. He was already gaining ground with each exchange, but a green's reserves weren't a joke, and time wasn't on his side. Come on! Just run out already. The pressure in the air was palpable, as Percy pushed himself beyond his limits, rapidly improving with each barrage. Never before had he had so much mana to play around with. And, as his projectiles grew sharper, their formations more elaborate, their trajectories more insidious, his status finally chipped in. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Mantle of Deceit. Refined-ish Shroud of Deceit. Refined. Oblivious to Percy's notification, Jason watched the latest wave of throwing stars close in. He didn't seem to be in a rush to stop the attack, probably realizing he couldn't sustain the expenditure for much longer. Yet, just when Percy thought he was finally going to land a hit, Jason smirked, some more mana vanishing from his core. What is he up to now? With no warning, Jason shot backwards like an arrow, at a speed Percy had never seen a human move before. And that was just the start. A few meters later, Jason took a steep turn, and then another. His movements were bizarre, to say the least. Unnatural. But they were effective too, as Jason bolted away uninterrupted, comfortably avoiding all the attacks. How? The scariest part wasn't Jason's speed alone, but the sheer finesse of his movements. On closer inspection, Percy realized what was happening. Jason hadn't twitched a muscle, his body seemingly dragged along the air by an invisible rope attached to his back, like a marionette pulled by a string. He's using his affinity on himself. But why didn't he do this earlier? Jason could have saved a lot of mana by pulling this trick out a minute or two ago. Then again, it wasn't that hard to figure out why he'd chosen not to. Coughing another mouthful of blood, Percy fell to his palms. A wave of weakness flooded his body, a slap of vertigo ringing his skull. He was just buying time for my potion to run out. Indeed, why would Jason reveal all his trump cards? It would have only given Percy a chance to adjust course or run away. All he had to do was spend a bit more mana to give him some false hope, keeping the charade of a fight going for a while longer. Grimacing, Percy looked up at his grinning opponent, evaluating his options. Yet, just when he was considering whether to stay or run, something unexpected happened. Both combatants jerked their heads in a certain direction, watching somebody emerge from the woods. Perhaps they would have noticed him sooner, had they not been as engrossed in the battle, or had the whistling cones not masked the newcomer's steps. "Who the hell are you?" Jason asked. But Percy didn't have to, recognizing him despite his horrific appearance. Rambert. Chapter 226. The Prey and the Predator. "I'm Rambert of House Tantalus," the newcomer replied in a hoarse, raspy voice. Pushing each word out of his lungs appeared like quite the challenge. "Tantalus." Jason tilted his head. "Ah, your families have been fighting over this province, right? But what the hell happened to you? Did you skip your vegetables as a child or something? Rambert's expression soured upon hearing the ill-concealed ridicule, though he didn't refute Jason, fully cognizant of his poor state. He was still missing the arm Percy had chopped off during their fight, his entire body pale and shriveled. Countless infected cuts covered him from head to toe, each of them oozing some disturbing brown sludge, a little too viscous and off-colored to be described as blood. If he wasn't moving and talking, one could easily mistake him for a corpse. And not a particularly fresh one at that. What do you think? This bastard did this to me? He snarled, some hatred spilling into his voice as he pointed towards Percy with a shaky finger. It's been weeks, and I still haven't managed to fix myself, right? I suppose that would explain the rather strong karmic thread linking you two. Jason shrugged. I'd have laughed at you for getting your ass handed to you by an orange, had I not spent the last 15 minutes fighting the little monster. Karmic? Is that what his affinity is? Percy focused on the most interesting part, tuning the rest of their conversation out. At the same time, he discreetly grabbed a couple healing potions from his pocket, silently uncorking them with his thumb. Honestly, I'd no idea this bastard had pissed the divine Rudolph too. I suppose you won't let me kill him? Rambert asked. Afraid not. My boss wants him alive. Jason replied. How did you even find us this quickly? Isn't your family based on the other side of the river? Rambert grimaced, but he wasn't quite ready to give up just yet. Apparently. It is, but we've been infiltrating their territories in search of easy pickings since the start of the war. And the two of you have raised quite a commotion. At least, tell me he won't have a good end. Jason grinned. That much I can guarantee. Deimos has never been a patient man, and this piece of shit has screwed with us for way too long. I'm pretty sure he will take great pleasure in gutting him himself. Then he turned towards Percy, who had remained silent during their brief conversation. The only thing I'm not sure about is how long it'll take for him to spill all his secrets. He's shown me quite a few interesting tricks tonight. Undeterred by Jason's predatory gaze, Percy swiftly turned around, chugging down the potions as he dashed into the trees. He nearly stumbled too, even staying on his wobbling feet being quite the struggle, let alone keeping synchronization active. But he didn't have a choice. If he stayed here, he was done for. Jason didn't seem surprised, nor particularly annoyed by Percy's escape attempt. He casually strolled behind him, launching one karmic bolt after the other, forcing him to clumsily dodge each of them by the skin of his teeth. Suffice to say, all of Percy's bones screamed in agony every time he rolled on the ground or collided against a tree. Still, he had to pick himself up quickly each time, lest the enchanted projectiles turn him into a pincushion. Through mana sense, Percy saw Rambert following behind them. Though he hadn't interfered, seemingly content enjoying the sadistic show for now. The only good news was that the healing potions were doing their job. The first two had already alleviated some of his pain and exhaustion, allowing him to keep moving, and he'd stashed quite a few of them in his pockets before the battle, preparing for the worst-case scenario. By the time he downed the sixth one, he was already doing much better, almost as if he'd never drank that Troll's Fury potion. Then again, he was at a severe disadvantage without its help. As things stood, dodging Jason's attacks was about the most he could manage. This novel is published on a different platform. Support the original author by finding the official source. I've got to hand it to you, you're quite resourceful, Jason said a couple minutes later, pausing his attacks. I'm starting to believe you really are an alchemist. A genius one at that. Not to mention your second core, your weird spells, and a sharp mind for battle too. Out of respect for all that, I'll give you one final chance to come with me willingly. Percy took a few more steps before stopping as well. Turning around, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. How dumb do you think I am? It hasn't even been 5 minutes since you promised Rambert I'll be tortured to death. Jason shrugged. Oh, don't take me wrong. That's still going to happen. There's no avoiding that. But it doesn't have to start tonight. You can at least walk back to the guild on your own 2 feet. It sure beats having to carry you. Percy chuckled. Thanks for the generous offer. I'm sorry I can't reciprocate. Suddenly, several black butterflies materialized in random spots around Jason, each of them flying rapidly towards him. Taken by surprise, he unleashed a wide burst of karma mana, wider than any he'd used against Percy's constructs, to ensure he intercepted all of them. Having already been warned about Jason's affinity, Nesha destroyed her butterflies the moment they got corrupted. She was supposed to change spots too, to make it harder for Jason to track her, though Percy couldn't tell if she'd done that. Either way, he wouldn't waste the opening she'd created for him. His body didn't produce as much mana without the potion, but Percy had gone out of his way to preserve as much of his shroud as possible. Pulling a hefty amount of it, he swiftly launched a wave of throwing stars against his opponent. TSCH. Did you honestly believe your girlfriend would be enough to make a difference? Jason merely used his earlier trick to pull himself away from the attack's path. His features shifted to shock, however, as soon as he noticed the fireballs closing onto him from behind. The hell are you doing? Jason swore, barely managing to avoid the attacks. Sadly for him, he never got a chance to catch his breath, however. Soon, a second round of butterflies materialized around him, followed by another wave of throwing stars. Finally, Rambert pitched in again with some more fireballs, as the three of them used everything they had to box Jason in. Panicking, the Karma Mage unleashed a tremendous wave of colorful mana from his body, freezing most of the spells to a halt. But not all of them. A green's willpower wasn't nearly as easy for him to override as Percy's or Nesha's, the fireballs still trudging through the air towards him, pushing against his control. Perhaps he could have won the tug of war, but it would have cost him more effort, mana and time. Either way, the projectiles were already dangerously close to him before he even made his mind up. Rambert detonated them all, Jason barely managing to pull himself away from their blast radius in time to avoid any serious injuries. Still, all these costly moves had already brought his reserves down to about a quarter of his capacity. Again, Percy yelled, this time putting every last mote of mana into the shroud, sacrificing synchronization to unleash the widest wave of throwing stars he was currently capable of. The others didn't shy away either, with Nesha manifesting a third round of butterflies, and Rambert sending more fireballs at Jason. Doing everything he could to survive, Jason zigged and zagged through the air, making full use of his rare affinity to dodge the storm of attacks, his core draining at a scary rate. By the time all the spells were dealt with, he didn't even have enough juice to seize control of the Soul Harvester spinning towards him. Leaping out of the scythe's path using his legs alone, he barely managed to lift his head up in time to see a near-skeletal hand close around his throat, before pressing him violently against the ground. Why? Jason gasped as his fellow green tried to choke him. I hate him. Probably more than you do, I bet. Rambert spat before sighing. But I don't have a choice. He's my only chance to survive. Jason's eyes widened at the sound of that, though he didn't bother replying. Grabbing Rambert's wrist, he tried to push it away. At first, it seemed to work too. Jason didn't have much trouble overpowering his peer, given the difference in their physical condition. However, there was one crucial difference between them that brute force alone couldn't bridge so easily. Jason was already out of mana, and Rambert wasn't. Before the latter's hand moved even an inch back, a bright orange flash emerged from the decaying palm. A deafening boom soon followed, drowning the ever-present tunes of the surrounding trees for a few seconds. Yet, Percy's eyes had remained locked on Jason throughout the whole exchange. It wasn't until the man's headless corpse became visible through the smoke that he allowed himself to plop down weakly. Chapter 227, Rambert. For a second there, I wasn't sure you'd help us, Percy said. What choice did I even have? Rambert shrugged as he walked closer. The only reason he was alive was because Percy had turned him into a clone. Of course, Percy had been pretty banged up after their battle, but Mickey had made things easier for him by eating Gryan's soul. I've upheld my end of the bargain, betrayed my house for you, even rushed here to save you from the divine root. It's time to do your part. Percy nodded. Naturally, Rambert wouldn't have helped the man who'd killed him out of kindness. His hastily stitched-up soul wouldn't hold by itself. Percy had intentionally left the seals incomplete, as a failsafe in case Rambert decided to betray him. And that wasn't even the biggest issue. Ironically, it was the Morais decree that did the most harm, by sucking out any life mana Rambert tried to use to heal his body. This was why he was still in this decrepit state despite his bloodline. Even after slaughtering every single resident of Bogside Town, it wouldn't have been enough to repair his second core. Not that Percy would have ever allowed him to commit such an atrocity, of course. Currently, there was only one person in the entire province capable of fixing Rambert in time, and he couldn't even hope to set up a meeting with Archibald unless Percy talked to his grandpa first. I promised you a chance, not a certainty, and things have gotten even more complicated since then. Before we dive into the details, I'll need to confirm a few things with you, Percy replied. Walking by his side, Nesha helped him up. She looked a little better than before, the potion having lifted the bulk of her exhaustion. Still, Percy wouldn't have involved her in this fight if he could have helped it. While she'd already proven herself, her mobility and defenses were lacking. Had the fight lasted longer, or had Percy not already deciphered Jason's abilities, things could have gone badly. This was why he'd hoped to take him down by himself. Sadly, things hadn't gone to plan. Just do what you must. Rambert nodded. To start, I'll need your word that you'll never tell a soul about my secrets. In fact, you shouldn't even mention me or Nesha again. Rambert grimaced upon hearing his first demand. Percy didn't press him either, waiting for him to come to terms. Of course, they both knew that Rambert hated him with a passion. It wasn't like he'd hidden it, but he'd have to make some concessions if he wanted to walk out of this forest alive. Even giving him this chance was merely out of principle. Now that Percy had gotten everything he needed from Rambert, it would be easier and safer to just dispose of him. Whether Rambert survived would all depend on his answers. Fine. Rambert spat after a while. I won't pretend to like it, but I've seen enough that I don't ever want to involve myself with you again. Besides, I'm sure the divine root will get to you soon enough. Percy listened to Rambert's answer while paying close attention to Nesha with his mana sense. Only after failing to get a reaction did he allow himself to relax. Next, swear you'll never lay a finger on any member of House Avalon. TSCH. A bit much, isn't it? Rambert snarled. Rambert, I'm not playing games with you. Do as I ask or our deal is off. Percy stared at him coldly. Listen, pal. I've no intention of participating in this war a moment longer. Or even staying in this province for that matter. My family is bound to figure out I've robbed them clean, if they haven't already. I want nothing more than to get healed and run halfway across Remir. That's not what I asked. Percy didn't relent, but Rambert gritted his teeth. If you spot this narrative on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. Look, I've got no beef with your house. If I'm willing to put down my feud with you, then why would I give a shit about anyone else? But those are hundreds of people we're talking about, all of whom hate me. I'm going to defend myself if anybody attacks me. Nesha's core remained still once more, confirming Rambert's sincerity. Of course, it wasn't exactly the answer Percy was looking for, but it was fair. Good enough. Last question. How many innocent people have you fed to your bloodline? This time, Percy didn't even need to wait for Nesha to know he'd struck a nerve. At least, he hadn't missed the cold shiver jolting through the man's soul. I've had to do it a few times that I'm not proud of, Rambert replied, looking away in what appeared to be genuine shame. Still, Percy hadn't missed Nesha's core flaring up the moment the word, few, popped up. Under 30? Yes. A lie. Any children among them? No. Another lie. The poor guy had no idea he had a truth-seeker scrutinizing his every word. By now, Percy had already made his mind up, though he still wanted to know one more thing. Why did you do it? You don't know what Drain is like, okay? It's nothing like your bloodline, giving you everything you could have ever hoped for. For me, it's just a curse. It just erodes at my sanity and my self-control, until I give in. Percy nodded. He knew it wasn't entirely their fault, though none of the members of House Tantalus he'd met had shown much regret in their actions. I can't really say I understand, but that's beside the point. I'm sure you'll do it again sooner or later, and your next victim will be on me.
Sorry.
You bastard. We had a deal, Rambert yelled, his core lighting up in fury as he leapt towards Percy, his hand igniting. Sadly for him, he didn't even get to reach his target before his eyes glazed over. By the time the corpse landed on the ground, Percy's wisp had returned to him, conveniently flooding his mind with an influx of memories. Of course, his clone had kept him relatively informed during the past month, though some details were easier to comprehend this way. Mickey, 2 green cores for you, Percy yelled. Soon, the crow waddled over eagerly, having remained by Nesh's side throughout the fight. He hadn't been in a condition to intervene, though his involvement couldn't be understated regardless. After all, it was through him that Percy had managed to coordinate with Nesha. In any case, the familiar started with Jason's body, apparently finding it a great deal more appetizing. Percy ignored him, searching Rambert's corpse instead. It didn't take him long to find the 5 spatial amulets the dead mage had stolen from his family's vault, stuffing them with elixirs. Wow! How many are there? Nesha asked. According to our estimates, around 175,000 doses. Their entire stash for the next 3 years. Percy replied, checking the storage devices one after the other. That much? Nesha was taken aback. Percy shrugged. It's a little more than the standard, but they've also lost a lot of people during the war. It must have massively cut their consumption down. Each of the amulets was no larger than his own, containing about 1 cubic meter of space. Naturally, that was plenty to accommodate tens of thousands of the pinky-sized vials, though Rambert had still been forced to pack them quite tightly to make all of them fit. Percy, with this much? Nesha spoke again, apparently having done the math in her head. Indeed, they should last us for well over a decade. Enough for all of us to advance. And we can do that even faster, once we make it to the Thirsty Valley. Next, he scratched his head upon thinking of a problem. I'm almost out of rainbow grass. We'll need to get more within the next couple of months. It won't be easy. Now that the divine root knows it's part of the recipe, they'll have their eyes out for any large movements. Percy sighed. It was true, though he didn't regret telling Deimos about it. He still hoped they wouldn't give Orin much trouble. Besides, they'd probably figured that part out already. At any rate, this meant they'd have to be more careful when procuring it. That, or Percy would have to find a different deattunement ingredient to replace it, neither of which was going to be easy. At least Jason is dead. Hopefully, they don't have any other karma users. Neither he nor Nesha said anything else. Instead, they took a seat by the base of a nearby tree, watching Mickey as he disposed of the bodies. It was a rather disturbing scene, as always, but Percy was happy to see his familiar a lot more energetic than he'd been in weeks. As good as regulation was, it couldn't entirely replace a proper meal. It'll make our journey easier, at least, he smiled. Next, he looked down in his hand, fiddling with a small box he'd also looted from Rambert. An unexpected treasure. What's that? Nesha asked, apparently only now noticing it. Percy's lips couldn't help but part upon hearing the question, revealing a bright, toothy grin. Opening the latch on the box, he lifted its lid, as both of their eyes landed on the aquamarine-colored object shimmering within. It looked a little like a petal, though it was rather oblong. Furthermore, it had an oval hole in its middle, the rest of its surface looping around it. In fact, its glow seemed to travel in wave-like patterns around the petal, almost giving it the appearance of a river. Is that what I think it is? Nesha seemed to have put 2 and 2 together. Yeep. End of Book 2. Phantom of the Haunted Bog. Chapter 228. Lotus of a Myriad Rivers. The Lotus. A priceless treasure Percy had wanted since before he'd even learned of its existence. The only object he'd ever heard of capable of changing one's affinity. And he'd gone through so much trouble to earn a petal from his family too, only for the opportunity to be ripped out of his hands at the very last moment. It's lucky I had a backup plan, Of course, this so-called backup plan had only really become available over the past month. Before turning Rambert into a clone, Percy hadn't known the man was due a petal from his family, nor had he expected to need his help to take down Jason, for that matter. These had all been coincidences. The only thing he'd wanted at the time had been for Rambert to loot his family's warehouse for him, to replenish his dwindling stash of elixirs. This was why he'd even settled in Bogside Town in the first place. Suffice to say, getting this far had taken Percy a little longer than expected, since he'd wanted to wait for a green host to maximize his odds. Sure, he could have made the attempt with Broos, but he'd needed the man's soul for a different project at the time. And the enemy house had really taken their sweet time sending the next batch of greens after them since then. So, what are you going to do with it? Nesha suddenly asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. A good question. Had Percy obtained a petal a couple years ago, he would have consumed it without a moment's hesitation. Even common elements were generally regarded as superior to the pure affinity, and Percy honestly needed any boost he could get. Then again, he hadn't stopped finding new uses for his second core since he got it, his pure affinity now being as integral to his arsenal as his soul affinity. Losing crystallization would be inconvenient. Same with synchronization, but those aren't deal-breakers by themselves, he said, getting a nod back. In theory, he didn't need to personally produce the crystals for the Aurora Dew. Pure affinity users were all over the place, so it wouldn't be that difficult to outsource the job. Sure, he'd have to look for somebody trustworthy, and to spend some time training them in the spell, but it would be dumber to ruin his future prospects just because of some minor inconvenience. As for synchronization, he would be able to use it again as soon as he opened up his new channels. Elaine had already proven it was possible. Sure, it would leave him weaker for a few months, but that was ultimately a small price to pay. But I'm not that keen on losing the Phantom Scale raiment, the Soul Harvester, or the mana threads I've been working towards, he added after a minute. Percy had really struck gold with his affinity fusion, or at least the uses he'd found for it. And not because of the pure affinity itself, but rather all the external influences he'd been able to weave into his kit. Namely, the Vault's runecrafting and his spectral trait. Obviously, the water affinity should be compatible with his soul mana too, but there was no way to tell if it would synergize as well with his other assets. The truth was, Percy had already made his mind up for months now. He wasn't the one who would be eating it. Mickey, come over here. I've got something for you. The familiar was just about done devouring the corpses, the potent mana contained within their cores having done wonders for his situation. Listening to Percy, he walked over, curious to see what this was all about. Eat this. Direct the mana it releases towards your second core, Percy said, handing him the glowing petal. Are you sure this is a good idea? Won't Mickey lose access to his spells? Same as you? Nesha asked. It's not the same. Percy shook his head. It was a well-known fact that composite affinity users could still access their component elements with some effort. After all, the two mana types would continue to coexist within Mickey's core, as neither of them would be able to override the other, unlike what would have happened to Percy. In fact, Percy knew a little more about the issue than most, as the Morais books had actually mentioned it. Apparently, the process of breaking a composite affinity into its components was known as affinity fission. As the name implied, it was the polar opposite of affinity fusion, and it took about the same amount of effort. With some practice, Mickey will be able to use his air magic again, not to mention all the new doors it will open for him. In his case, there's no dilemma whatsoever. This is a net upgrade. Nesha didn't say anything else. The two just watched as the oversized crow gulped the glowing petal down. Mickey sent Percy his thoughts and feelings too, to let him oversee the process. The first thing Percy sensed was the refreshing feeling trickling down the bird's throat. It was as if Mickey had just drank a mouthful of the freshest, coolest water. The moment it splashed within the crow's stomach, the petal dissolved almost immediately, as if it had never been solid to begin with. Support the creativity of authors by visiting Royal Road for this novel and more. Following his earlier instructions, Mickey then used his air mana as a carrier, guiding the dissolved petal into his abdomen, in a process reminiscent of core purification. It was only once the petal arrived at its destination that it stopped behaving like an elixir entirely, doing something completely different. Latching on the core's walls, the substance soon began to seep through them, infecting the entire organ inside out. It wasn't like a physical substance either. It felt almost like Mickey's core had been invaded by a brand new idea. Are core affinities ultimately just concepts? Percy couldn't help but wonder. While mortals like him often viewed magic in terms of elements and abilities, gods experienced the same things from a different perspective entirely. From what little he knew about them, the lofty deities standing at the pinnacle of magic didn't differentiate themselves based on grades or the colors of their cores, but the sheer number of concepts they had mastered. The blessings some mortals were lucky to inherit from their divine parents were nothing more than concepts themselves. Oblivious to Percy's thoughts, the two concepts continued to fight for control over Mickey's core. His air affinity embodied excitement and freedom. It playfully jumped around the core, not particularly welcoming to its guest. Meanwhile, the water affinity moved more calmly, trying to chill the organ down, to make it more in line with its preferences. The air affinity seemed to dominate at first, perhaps due to having the home advantage initially. Things appeared to turn around, however, once the rest of the dissolved petal was brought to the crow's abdomen. The water affinity soon gained ground, only stopping once the two forces were evenly matched. Now what's going to happen? Percy's heart skipped a beat at the sight. Logically, he knew this was how things were supposed to go, though he couldn't help but worry as he observed the two parties warring within his familiar's body. If they continued at this rate, they'd rip the crow to shreds. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Unable to gain an advantage, the two affinities seemed to accept their fate a few minutes later, calming down. It appeared they would be sharing the core after all. No wonder the lotus is only compatible with other elemental affinities. Percy realized. Had there been a rare affinity in there, he wasn't sure the two concepts would have reached an equilibrium as easily. And let's not even imagine what would have happened if Mickey had already possessed a composite affinity. Throwing a third element into the mix would have easily been catastrophic. "How are you feeling?" Nesha asked, apparently having also realized the process had come to an amicable conclusion. "Like crap," Mickey spat. "My second core feels different. I can't even pull any mana from it." "Don't worry about it," Percy said. "This is supposed to happen. You won't be able to access it unless you open your new channels. Well, you can still pull the air mana through the old channels, but you'll need to separate it from the rest first." "Wait, what? How am I going to use regulation then?" Mickey panicked. "Just use hibernation for now to reduce your expenditure. I'll feed you some of my fused mana until then." Suffice to say, Mickey wasn't very keen to lose access to his latest spell, though it couldn't be helped. This was ultimately a good thing. Even if they ignored the new affinity itself, circulation would grow a great deal stronger once the crow mastered the new patterns. After all, his second core would be connected to a whopping 3 sets of mana channels, letting him store a lot more mana inside his body. In any case, Percy and Nesha had a lot more cleaning up to do before they left the area, but he couldn't help opening his status first, curious to see all the changes to both his and Mickey's pages. Undersir. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana core 1, Orange Soul. Mana core 2, Orange Pure. Bloodline. Clone, create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Mutations. As Sorcerer's Eye, draws from the cumulative knowledge listed in the status to enhance one's vision, allowing them to discern details previously unseen. Spectral trait. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Spells. Secret art. Familiar, crude. Spectral art. Soul stitching, refined. Wild art. Greater foresight, refined. Wild art. Grim dance, refined. A phantom scale raiment, refined. A soul conversion, refined. A soul harvester, refined. Reinforcement, refined. A synchronization, refined. A shroud of deceit, refined. Alchemic principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. A pacification. delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection, adjust an ingredient's effect. Deattunement, prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding, enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Decrees, Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Iapetus' decree grants a bloodline. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. Metatron's decree, open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Grants the Sorcerer's Eye. Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's Familiar. Mana cores. A mana core 1, yellow, beast. A mana core 2, orange, ice. Mutations. A soul predator. Allows one to more easily interact with the souls of others. Wind Dancer. Allows one to augment their flight using air mana. Spells. Wild Art. Regulation, refined. Wild Art. Rending Tornado, refined.
Circulation refined.
Decrees. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. Chapter 229, Future. Ice, Interesting but not that surprising. All the composite affinities were widely known, so Percy had a pretty good idea what they were getting ahead of time. He still had no clue what Mickey could use the new affinity for, though he certainly hoped the bird would get another mutation or two the next time his beast core advanced. Percy, we need to get out of here, Nesha reminded him. He nodded. It would be a while until Deimos figured out what had happened to Jason, but that didn't mean they could afford to waste their precious head start. Of course, they still had some unfinished business in the Whistling Woods. Sighing, Percy walked over to Jason's mutilated corpse. Just the man's bloodied belongings. Really, as Mickey had already devoured anything even remotely edible. Percy doubted he'd get as much stuff as he'd looted from Rambert. But a scion of the Divine Root ought to have some valuables of his own. Such a pity we can't keep this, he said, picking the communication device up. Percy would have liked to examine its enchantments a little longer. It was definitely one of the most advanced pieces of tech he'd seen on Remir. Engraved with multiple interconnected runes, it could even be considered a nascent version of Magiscript. Its scope still fell short of the vault standards, but he could learn a thing or two studying it. That said, he couldn't risk the possibility that Deimos could track it down. Besides, he couldn't even activate it without the correct affinities. Tossing it by Nesha's feet, Percy watched her tear it to shreds with a couple of butterflies, before stomping the fragments into dust and scattering them in the wind. That ought to have been enough. Is this what I think it is? Percy asked, picking a familiar-looking object from among the tattered robes. Wow! These bastards are filthy rich, aren't they? Nesha echoed his feelings, also recognizing the spatial amulet. Generally, each of them cost over 1 million contribution points to commission. Most noble families kept a few in their warehouses, usually reserving them for their blues. Anyone below that wasn't important enough to be carrying the equivalent of 8 months of elixirs on their person. Then again, the Divine Root wasn't a regular house either. They probably had more money than they knew what to do with. What's inside it? Nesha asked again. Shrugging, Percy opened the device before scanning its contents, though he failed to suppress a grimace soon after. TSCH. I'm sure he had more elixirs when he started his mission, but he's drank most of them by now. Only a few weeks left. Is that everything? Well, he does have a couple dozen healing potions. Other than that, it's mostly money, food, and fancy clothes. The money and the food we can keep, I guess. But the clothes we'll have to get rid of. There was also a dose of Aurora Dew in there, along with a few yellow guild robes. Percy guessed these were the things Jason had relied on to locate them. Storing the consumables away, he poured all the garments into a pile on the ground. He and Nesha would have to get changed too. They hadn't had the chance earlier, given the urgency of their escape, but they couldn't afford to look like nobles from here on out. Luckily, they'd had the foresight to pack a few clean linen outfits within their first couple of days at the mansion. Hey, what's that? Nesha asked, pointing at a bronze badge glinting among the man's robes. The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. It depicted a series of roots emerging from the underside of a cloud, the divine roots insignia. I guess it's like his identification or something, Percy said. It's enchanted. Should we destroy it too?
Non.
The enchantment is quite simple. It's not releasing much mana either. I doubt anybody can track it from afar. It's probably just there to verify the authenticity of the badge, and to tell it apart from others. What's the point in keeping it, though? Well, we are trying to infiltrate the Thirsty Valley. Maybe it'll help. He shrugged. Separating the man's belongings into two piles, Percy left Nesha and Mickey in charge of destroying the first one, while taking his sweet time storing anything they wanted to keep within the spatial amulets. Percy's original amulet, as well as the 5 he had taken from House Tantalus, were already full, but the new one had a lot more space. By the time they were done, the sun had already come out. Percy tossed his surroundings one last look. He had no idea when he'd next have a chance to visit home. Possibly never. The trio was about to head out when they heard the sound of footsteps. "Who's there?" Percy asked, drawing mana out of both cores. His companions prepared themselves too, though everyone relaxed once they caught sight of the newcomer. "Elaine, what are you doing here?" Nesha asked. "Hey guys, I've spent all night looking for you," Elaine greeted. An apologetic smile plastered all over her face. "Thank Phoebe you're all okay. I wanted to come with you from the beginning, but I couldn't leave without telling my parents goodbye. I don't know if I'll ever see them, or Owain again." "What do you mean?" Percy asked, not liking where this was going. "What else? I'm coming along. To the Thirsty Valley. And wherever you end up going after that." "Have you lost your mind?" Percy snapped. "Go back to the mansion before anybody sees you with us. This isn't a game, Elaine. You can easily ruin your whole future." Elaine rolled her eyes at his outburst. "Percy, I'm not an idiot. I know damn well what I'm doing. I've already discussed it with Grandpa and Uncle Galahad at length." Percy was taken aback. "You're telling me Galahad agreed to let the family's most promising green leave with a banished criminal?" "Well, not exactly. He was against it," Elaine reluctantly admitted. "But Grandpa was okay with it. Look, he gave me this," she replied, dangling yet another spatial amulet in front of Percy and Nesha. "He even allowed me to bring 3 months of elixirs with me. FYI, that's the maximum anybody can take on a mission." She added a moment later, "Oh, but officially I'm just going out to hunt scorpions again for a few months. No need to bust my cover if I can help it." Percy's jaw would have hit the ground if it wasn't attached to his face. Took him a whole minute to find the words to reply. Why the hell would he do that? I already feel like shit for all the trouble I've caused. The last thing I want is to have this on my conscience too, he muttered. Elaine shook her head, however. "Percy, do you know the difference between Galahad and Grandpa?" she asked. "What sort of question is that? I guess Galahad is a bigger jerk." Elaine chuckled. "Yes, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's true that both of them have warmed up to you after coming to terms with your potential, but Uncle Galahad is still a step behind. He only sees you as an asset. He would like to have you around, if possible, but not if the price is too high." Percy nodded, though he still had no clue where Elaine was going with this. "Well, Grandpa is different. By now, he understands the truth about you. As do I." "What truth?" "You're the future of House Avalon, Percy. You're more important than any of us will ever be. The things you have already achieved are more than our entire family has managed in 2,000 years. One day, we will all be defined and remembered by the way you lived. No price is too high to ensure your safety." Percy didn't know what to say in response to that. That was quite the high praise, and he knew his cousin was sincere about it too. Still, it did little to curb his guilt. What if House Avalon comes to be hated by the rest of Remire because of me? Elaine pulled him into a tight embrace before replying. "As far as I'm concerned, you're the future of Remire too, Percy. Even if those idiots are blind to it, Neither Percy nor Nesha said anything more to dissuade Elaine. She'd already made it quite clear that she had no intention of turning back. Instead, they brought her up to speed on the events of the previous night, before the group of 4 finally set out. Percy still wasn't too happy about this, but there was no denying that Elaine was quite a powerful helper to bring along. Using circulation, his cousin could probably beat even the likes of Jason. Just like that, their group's fighting strength had shot through the roof. And there was one more thing she was bringing to the table. I suppose Mickey just gained himself a teacher. Chapter 230, Noland. Gods. I missed sending out clones so damn much. By now, Percy's bloodline was more than just a fancy ability or a means of growing stronger. It was a way of life, a source of endless adventures, a window into the wider cosmos, part of who he was. Sadly, his circumstances had robbed him of this joy over the past few months. Atlantis had been a wake-up call. His intention at the time had been to keep the trips short and infrequent, to leave the connection available in case House Tantalus attacked. After all, he'd needed to have an ethereal cord ready to possess the enemy green. Suffice to say, things hadn't gone to plan. While there was no denying his time in the underwater world had been among his most fruitful adventures yet, it had also lasted several weeks, making the whole thing quite risky. Had his clone not returned by the time Rambert arrived in Bogside Town, Percy would have forever missed his chance to infiltrate the enemy house. Not only would he have failed to procure the elixirs, he would have lost his only shot at a petal too. And that's without even considering that Jason might have captured him. Consequently, Percy had chosen to put his trips on hold until after the mission was over. Oh well, maybe I'll be able to have more clones at Yellow. The greatest improvement to his ability to maintain multiple connections had occurred once his second core reached Orange. Strengthening his presence, the promotion had allowed him to keep a familiar and a clone at the same time without losing himself in the process. Before then, he'd had to deal with all sorts of problems whenever his soul was splintered. Alas, it would be a while before he could test out that theory. In any case, I'd better focus on the here and now. Hello? Anybody there? Turning his attention back to his latest host, Percy reached out, hoping to interact with them. They were at Orange this time, a sapient too, and a rather healthy one at that. Luckily, he didn't have to wait very long for a response. Thank the shimmering crystals beneath. Please help me. A distraught voice rang within Percy's mind. Can you give me a quick summary of your situation first? Percy asked. Knowing what I'm dealing with would make things a lot easier. The situation? Well, what's there to tell? I was too busy enjoying my meal to notice the tunnel behind me had collapsed. By the time I realized, I was already gasping for air. Percy would have frowned if he could. Were you exploring in a mine or something? A wave of confusion soon seeped through their connection, however. It wasn't like his host hadn't understood the question. They just found it a little strange Percy would ask that. How else am I supposed to be spending my days? Gotcha. Percy spat back, already harboring some guesses about his host. Without wasting a moment, he allowed his instincts to take over, using his stashed mana to patch the guy's soul up. I'm Percy, by the way, he said a few minutes later, once he was nearly done. Noland, his host replied. Tying the final batch of strings into a preservation rune, Percy allowed his soul to slip into the remaining gaps, tapping into Noland's senses. An overwhelming amount of pressure surrounded him from every direction, reminding him a little of his time in Enki's body. Though the pressure was even higher here, somehow, than it had been at the bottom of the ocean. It was dark too, also hot, really hot, and moving even an inch was almost impossible, as if Noland had been buried alive. Okay, I'm out of moves here. Do you have any idea what's going on? He asked. Luckily, his host didn't appear particularly worried. He merely shrugged, before moving in a certain way. He brushed his arms against his torso, pushing the tips of his hands towards his head. Percy felt their clawed fingers stab through soil, as the dirt pressed against their nails. Once Noland had fully stretched his arms, he moved them aside, pushing the dirt away while propelling his body forward. With the ease befitting of a native, Nolan practically swam through the ground itself, making it a point to hold his breath throughout the process. Reading on Amazon or a pirate site. This novel is from Royal Road. Support the author by reading it there. I'm 90% sure this is the way I came from, he said, completely oblivious to Percy's sheer awe. Hopefully. He didn't even get to the end of the sentence when the ground in front of him collapsed, letting him spill out into a different tunnel. This one was wider and already dug, allowing Nolan to stand up without much effort. More importantly, it was filled with air. Opening his lips, Percy's host inhaled one mouthful after another, greedily filling his lungs as if his life depended on it. Do your people spend all their time underground? Percy asked. At the same time, he scanned Nolan's body as best as he could. Unfortunately, the guy's eyesight wasn't the best. Luckily, a few glowing crystals illuminated the tunnel to an extent, allowing him to barely make out his host's features. Nolan's body was humanoid, for the most part. However, it was covered in dense fur from head to toe. This was one of those times Percy would have loved to have his sorcerer's eye at hand. Sadly, he had discovered soon after his return from Atlantis that his clones didn't inherit the mutation. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because the decree could only grant the mutation once, or because the part responsible for granting it had broken when it got modified. Either way, it meant he wouldn't be able to access his fancy eyes during his adventures, nor would he be able to pass them along to his companions. Then again, it wasn't all bad. At least, he wouldn't have to spend a few days in pain each time. And he wouldn't have to worry about giving Metatron more freebies either. Of course, Nolan replied, breaking him out of his thoughts. Why would anybody wander close to the surface? It's freezing cold out there. Not to mention how thin the air is. Percy shrugged. He had a lot more questions. He would like to know how there was even breathable air down here, for one. But he figured he'd consult with his status first. Undersir. Nolan, Percival's clone. Mana cores. A Mana Core 1, Orange, Gravity. Mana Core 2 Seed? Spectral trait. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Spells. Spectral art. Soul stitching, refined. A phantom scale raiment, refined. A soul harvester, refined. Reinforcement, refined. A shroud of deceit, refined. Alchemic principles. Extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. A pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. A deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Morai's decree, incomplete, grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's decree, open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Undersir. No new decree, but this is my first time running into a gravity affinity. Percy noted. If nothing else, he definitely wanted to see the rare mana type at work. Whoa! What the hell is that? Nolan exclaimed upon seeing the status. Tell you what, I'll answer your questions, as long as you answer some of mine. Percy offered, getting a nod back. Over the next few minutes, host and guest chatted, bringing each other up to speed. Percy explained how his bloodline allowed him to possess dying bodies, and the kinds of things he hoped to get out of his travels. As for Nolan, he shared a little more about his life and this world. Apparently, this place was called Subterra. Contrary to most places Percy had been to, the surface itself wasn't livable, but the situation was better for a few dozen miles below that. The temperature was more bearable, so the natives had only had to adapt to the pressure so they could survive. A fairly widespread type of blue moss was single-handedly responsible for pumping the underground tunnels full of breathable air, allowing the local wildlife to flourish. In terms of their magical progress, Nolan's people had drawn the short end of the stick. Once again, Percy had found himself on a world lacking a means of advancement, limiting the indigenous population to the lower grades. Noland, how would you rate your life here on a scale of 1 to 10? Percy suddenly asked. Noland raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question. Weird thing to ask, but I'd have to go with a low 2. On a good day, he said, pretty much in line with Percy's expectations. Based on what his host had shared, Percy had seen this coming. After all, Noland was, by his own admission, a bit of a loner. He'd run away from his family from a young age, preferring to wander Subterra by himself. Life here wasn't particularly easy either. Even moving around was tough and rife with dangers. Accidents like the one that had nearly claimed the man's life happened nearly every day. How about this? I can offer you a one-way trip to a different hell, if you want it. Percy suggested. It's not necessarily better, mind you, just different. I'm listening. Chapter 231. Ambitious Projects. The last thing Percy wanted was to mislead Noland into ruining his life. Suffice to say, he'd made it abundantly clear that the Vault of Magic was a veritable dystopia, full of callous gods who treated their own children as trash. He emphasized that he didn't even have a clue what Metatron did to the test subjects. For all he knew, they all ended up dissected on an operating table somewhere. Well, not really. I'm confident he keeps them around, at least. But you might just spend the rest of your life in a cage if you're unlucky. Still, as much as Percy had harped on the vault's downsides, the advantages were also undeniable. For one, Noland would never have to dig another day in his life. He would likely never have to forage for food either. Sure, the vault's deities might subject him to all kinds of torture, but starvation was unlikely to be on the list. And you said I'll get a second core? Noland asked. Technically, you already have that. You just need to find a lot of life mana. Percy clarified. Screw that. It's been years since I last saw a vitality worm. Just sign me up for this place already. Are you absolutely sure? Percy asked. Like I said, there's no going back. Even if you hate it, you'll be stuck there. Noland shrugged. I'm sick of Subterra anyway. Every day is the same. Just digging through a mountain of dirt, hoping to find a morsel of food on the other side, trying not to suffocate in the process. But can you repeat the part about the challenges real quick? Percy raised an eyebrow, wondering why his host would be interested in that. Of all the things he'd shared about the vault, the challenges were among the few that might not even concern Noland. Still, he ultimately recapped everything, talking about both the combat and the Magiscript challenges. The latter were the ones he was hoping to target this time, as there were a few new runes he needed to learn. That said, he did want to give the others a chance too. Even if he failed to clear any waves, he could at least experience a gravity affinity firsthand. Sounds good. Then, do you mind delaying the trip by a few days? Noland asked. I've got an idea to help you blitz through the early waves of those combat challenges you mentioned. Consider it a thanks for saving my life. Careful, Noland warned as Percy tried to pick the sacks off the metallic floor. If you bump those things too hard, we're goners. Before entering the portal, Noland had spent the last 3 days procuring a few things for the trip. The first was his food, just some tasteless grubs. Really? He'd harvested those from the slimy walls of a cavern located a few hours away from where Percy had met him. According to Noland, that place was something like a secret stash he generally left untouched, to use in case his daily forages didn't go that well. Obviously, he wouldn't be needing that any longer. Suffice to say, Percy wasn't particularly thrilled by the idea of eating live bugs for the next month or so, but they were supposedly rather nutritious. In any case, the second bag Noland had brought along was a lot more interesting. It contained some glowing orange crystals he claimed would explode with quite a bit of force if they weren't handled with care. If Noland hadn't exaggerated their effect, they definitely sounded powerful enough to take a bunch of orange golems out. First things first, he shrugged, before pressing his palm against the floor. User ID Wanderer. Authorization granted. Welcome back to the vault, Percy. The cube replied as soon as he had worn the translation device back on. If you stumble upon this narrative on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Whoa! That's seriously cool. But why are all these people staring at us? Noland asked. Percy rolled his eyes. I told you to get some clothes before coming here. It's not my first time coming here naked, but most of my previous hosts were either beasts or demi-humans. Noland hadn't thought it necessary at the time. Percy was still unsure if it was just his host being an eccentric, or if all his people were nudists. Maybe it was just a consequence of living underground? Either way, he wasn't the one who'd be staying in the vault with this body. If Noland didn't care, why should he? Shaking the pointless thoughts out of his head, Percy then dragged the 2 bags to the challenge cubes, this time employing a little more caution. It was only once they arrived there that he asked the system for his life mana. A process that didn't take more than a few minutes. There. All done. You mean I've got a second core now? Percy nodded. Next, he briefed him in on the logistics, asking him to spend the next few days clearing his channels. This was one of the perks of coming to the vault with a sapient host. At least, he wouldn't have to do everything by himself this time. So, what will you be doing in the meantime? Noland asked. Studying. Admittedly, Percy's goals for this trip were rather ambitious. To get through the second wave of the Orange Magiscript Challenge, he'd need to draw a total of 10 runes. Currently, he could only use 5, the Concealment, Preservation, Control, Hardness, and Absorption runes. Of course, he had also learned to draw the Pocket and Stability runes he'd relayed to Nesha, but he couldn't activate either of those without space mana. Learning 5 more runes was already a lot. Not to mention that he also intended to delve into the basics of Magiscript proper this time, to finally start combining runes together into more interesting enchantments. Had this been a year ago, he wouldn't have stood a chance at this, but learning new runes got easier the more you practiced. And Percy had practiced a lot, while maintaining his armor and scythes in preparation for the ambush. In addition to that, he was already a foot into Magiscript, as he'd spent some time learning to attach the control runes to his other enchantments, familiarizing himself with the process. I should still strive to get everything done in the next 2 months. Technically, he wasn't that pressed for time. His destination on Remir was easily over 3 months away. Furthermore, he'd already discussed things with Nesha and Elaine. The group had decided to take their sweet time getting there, even if it meant running out of rainbow grass and having to downgrade to the regular elixirs for a few weeks. After all, the last thing they wanted was to rush and leave a trail for the divine route to follow. Still, he'd rather not stay in the vault longer than he had to. Every second he spent here was a second he could be investing into a different clone. Entering the cube, he propped the 2 bags by a wall, before browsing through the system for the runes he wanted. Sadly, he still had to go about it via the tedious way. With over 200 credits, he could just about afford the rune index, but that would leave him broke. This time, I need to make sure I earn enough credits to get the index before I leave. It's going to save me more money in the long run, he sighed, listening to the cube recount the books he'd picked. Without knowing exactly what each volume contained, he often had to buy a couple of them to ensure he ended up with a suitable variant. Evaluation complete. User has bookmarked a total of 14 items. Memory Rune, Volume 4, 11, Growth Rune, Volume 1, 3, 16, Heat Rune, Volume 7, 8, Pressure Rune, Volume 17, 21, Rotation Rune, Volume 2, 16, 18, Cascading Control Enchantment, Self-Repair Enchantment. Total cost, 180 credits. Current balance, 209. Percy felt his heart clench upon hearing the price. A wave of curiosity soon seeped through the cord, but he just brushed it aside. Poor Noland still had no idea how stingy his new compatriots were. Just do it already. I'll have them as hard copies this time, he sighed. Confirmed. Deducting credits. New balance, 29. Delivery in 12 writs. It didn't take long for the cube to spit a towering stack of books out, each of them steaming hot. Percy didn't waste a moment before picking the first one up. In any case, there was no reason why he couldn't enjoy his time here. If he ignored the painful challenges, the steep costs when buying anything inside the vault, and the strict schedule he was always under, studying runecrafting wasn't that bad in and of itself. Honestly, Percy liked delving into the topic, even from a purely academic perspective. Magiscript was, in many ways, superior to real-time spellcasting. Sure, it wasn't easy to draw a functioning rune in the midst of battle, let alone a more complex enchantment. Still, with enough preparation, one could accomplish pretty much anything they set their minds to, as Dranold and Rambert had found out the hard way. Not to mention world-spanning marvels of magic like the vault itself. Of course, Percy wasn't nearly ready for such a large-scale project just yet. He currently had two slightly more modest goals in mind. One had to do with alchemy, the other with his phantom-scale raiment. The thought made him grin. If this works, I'll never have to worry about my armor's maintenance again. Chapter 232. Self-Repair. Percy's top priority during this trip was the self-repair enchantment. While his reinforced mana had proven an excellent material for his constructs, its greatest drawback was that it didn't last nearly as long as he would like. Even when he used his preservation runes to extend the lifetime of his spells, the sheer amount of time he had to spend maintaining them made many of his projects untenable. Of course, this applied just as much to his scythes, as well as anything else he might create, but the problem was most pronounced when it came to the phantom scale raiment. It simply involved way too many components, making its upkeep an absolute nightmare. Let's see. The simplest version of the enchantment requires the memory and growth runes. All in all, it wasn't that complicated. As the name implied, the memory rune would essentially memorize the shape of an object as it was at the very moment when the enchantment was activated. From there, it would constantly feed this information into the growth rune much like a magical blueprint. In turn, the growth rune would restore the object to its intended shape whenever it deviated however slightly. That said, there were countless variants of these runes, much like the rest Percy had come across during his studies. Usually, they differed depending on the materials the enchantment would consume to repair the item. After all, the lost materials couldn't be replenished out of thin air. Luckily, all of Percy's constructs were made purely out of his own mana, so he hadn't needed to look beyond the simplest variants. According to everything he'd read, the final product would be extremely straightforward to use in his case. He'd only need to pour some mana into the runes once per day, and they would take care of the rest, keeping his armor in top condition. By adding his preservation runes to the mix, he could extend that time even further. It's not even that important. Spending a minute or two per day is infinitely better than having to reforge the whole thing from scratch. Then again, there were a couple more issues he'd have to solve before he could apply this to his armor, but those were for after he returned to Remir. Right now, his priority was to actually master the enchantment. The Vault's Magiscript offers two primary approaches to concatenating runes. As Percy had learned pretty early on, combining runes required them to be linked together in some manner. Most runecrafting languages, including the one they had on Remir, only provided a single avenue of doing so. Usually, it involved drawing the runes side by side, taking advantage of some shared feature to fuse them together. The brilliance of Metatron's language was that it also allowed one to stack multiple runes on top of one another, thanks to the circular shape most of them had in common. This gave its users many more options when trying to enchant an object, allowing them to create far more interesting things. The good news is that I don't have to reinvent the wheel just yet. He exhaled in relief. Self-repair enchantments were extremely common, and the book Percy had bought contained countless examples. Of course, it wouldn't always be this easy. Once he started improvising his own enchantments, Percy would have to get better at figuring this out by himself. Luckily, this was a project for later. Besides, even just copying the enchantment down came with its own share of challenges. As always, when merging multiple runes, one had to keep both their individual effects in their mind, as well as their joint function. Consequently, the difficulty climbed exponentially with the number of involved runes. Cube, start the Magiscript Challenge, Orange Level, Wave 2. User ID Wanderer. Noland raised an eyebrow in surprise, but Percy reassured him that there was nothing to worry about. Authorization granted. Wave begins in 18 writs. Obviously, he wasn't even close to meeting the requirements just yet. Then again, there was no penalty for failing the Magiscript Challenge, so there was no reason why he couldn't practice inside it. That way, he could keep track of his progress too. Wave begins. May your challenge be successful. Enchantments. Memory, General, Variant number 61. Growth, General, Variant number 24. Self-repair, General, Variant number 3145. Difficulty, 1.6. Runes drawn, 1231. Time taken, 20,000 writs. Success rate, 34%. Score adjusted due to difficulty, 54%. Wave failed. Try again. You might be reading a pirated copy. Look for the official release to support the author.
Non.
And please stop listing the variants I used. The messages are getting a little clustered. Choice confirmed. It had been over a week since Percy began practicing. As expected, getting the new runes down had been a piece of cake. Relatively speaking. It was just merging them together that was proving quite a pain in the ass. Not only was it much more time-consuming, his success rate on the self-repair enchantment by itself was still below 20%. That said, he'd discovered quite a few new interesting things while experimenting in the challenge. This might go better than expected. He couldn't help but grin. Apparently, the cube counted the self-repair enchantment and its components as different runes when drawn separately. For the second wave of the challenge, Percy needed to draw 10 runes in total, which he had originally planned to achieve after learning the new batch of runes. However, he hadn't considered the possibility of cheating his way with combinations. Just sticking the control rune onto all the others might be enough to get me through the third wave too. Between the self-repair enchantment and 9 controlled variants, he would have access to 20 enchantments in total. He still didn't know what the requirements of the third wave involved, but that ought to be enough, right? And it got even better than that. The greatest downside when concatenating runes was the added difficulty. However, it seemed the system was more than willing to compensate him for that, at least to an extent, by adding a difficulty modifier and adjusting his final score. In any case, there was a reason why Percy had taken a break from runecrafting, and it had nothing to do with the challenge. Rather, it was his host that had prompted him to pause for a few minutes. Wow. When you told me you'd be spending all your time doing this, you weren't kidding. Noland whistled. I hope this Metatron guy doesn't make his test subjects learn Magiscript. My brain ain't built for sitting around all week. Percy couldn't help but roll his eyes. It hadn't been that long since the guy begged him to bring him here, sick of laboring all day in his underground hell. I take it you're done clearing your channels? He asked, changing the topic. Noland nodded, eagerly drawing some ambient mana into his new core, reveling in the feeling of power rushing through his body. Percy didn't pay that much attention, however, having experienced this sort of thing a few too many times. Instead, he scrutinized the mana itself carefully, trying to discern its affinity. Bad news for you, he said, instantly recognizing the unmistakable feeling of pure mana gushing out of his abdomen, forming a small sai and dagger in his hand. Though this was good for him. Drawing the runes with a familiar affinity would be much easier. I don't really mind. A second core is still a second core. Noland shrugged. A healthy attitude to have. Percy nodded, slightly jealous to see how much better his host had taken the news. Then again, Percy had been a teenager when this happened to him. Shaking the pointless thoughts out of his head, Percy gave Noland a few minutes to stretch a little and grab himself a snack, before walking back to the center of the room. Cube. Start the challenge again. User ID Wanderer. This time, he intended to put the self-repair enchantment aside for a few hours, to earnestly tackle the wave. Between the new core and the cheat he had recently discovered, he already possessed all the tools he needed to clear it. This way, he'd be able to learn the next wave's requirements early on, giving himself ample time to prepare. Okay then. Let's do this thing. He took a seat, reading the prompt one last time. Draw any 10 runes 1,500 times in total, in under 20,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual rune has to be drawn at least 100 times. The most annoying part about the Magiscript challenge was how long each attempt took. By Percy's estimates, 20,000 writs were already nearly 7 hours, and this was still a relatively low level. I sure hope I got it this time, he sighed. This was actually his second attempt after having made his mind up. Suffice to say, It was with bated breath that his eyes landed on the prompt. Enchantments. Preservation, concealment, hardness, absorption, control, memory, growth, controlled preservation, controlled concealment, controlled hardness. Difficulty 1.2. Runes drawn, 1500. Time taken, 19,743 writs. Success rate, 83%. Score adjusted due to difficulty, 99%. Thank Phoebe. It was mostly the controlled variance that had held him back. The score adjustment itself had made up for his lower success rate, but it hadn't given him any extra time, forcing him to just barely complete the wave by the skin of his teeth. And that was after filling the last 500 spots in his quota with the simple control runes. Alas, congratulations! Wave 2 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 200. Current balance, 229.
Ok.
I think I get why you're doing this. Noland pitched in. I admit, this is quite the adrenaline rush you get once you succeed. Right? Percy would have hugged him if they weren't sharing a body. Of course, the exhilaration of beating a wave was only a small part of it. The real prize were the amazing spells he'd be able to craft once he returned home. Oh well, one step at a time. First, I need to master the enchantment. Then, I've got a few more books to read before trying the third wave. And there's the other cheat we brought along. Percy hadn't forgotten about the explosives they had prepared for the combat challenges. The idea of blowing those annoying spider golems to shreds was honestly one of the things keeping him going. Just a little longer. Chapter 233, Cascading Control. 100. Percy muttered as he finished drawing the last instance of the self-repair enchantment. The growth rune was made of an inner circle, with multiple tendril-like features extending outwards in specific patterns, making it resemble a caricature of the sun. At any rate, this inner circle was rather easy to pair with the outermost circle of the memory rune, which was filled with a grid-like pattern in turn. Suffice to say, Percy began all his challenge attempts with the self-repair enchantments, as they were the hardest and most time-consuming ones to draw by far. If he failed, he could just abort the wave and start over, saving himself some time. Luckily, he didn't need to do that right now, his current attempt being just about passable. So far, so good. Let's go for the controlled variants next. By now, Percy had spent over 6 weeks in the vault. He'd already reached a satisfactory level with the self-repair enchantment. Even though he couldn't draw it successfully every single time, he didn't need to. As it so happened, reality was more forgiving than the damn challenge, at least for what he intended to use it. He only had to succeed once for each piece of his armor and it would work forever. Naturally, he could afford to try a couple of times until he got it right. In addition to that, he'd also studied the other runes he'd bought. The heat, pressure, and rotation runes hadn't been picked randomly. They were the bread and butter of any alchemic cauldron worth a damn, and Percy had already decided they would be handy to know. Not only would he be able to craft his own cauldrons with his clones in case he needed them, much like what had happened on Atlantis, but he would be able to repair his own back on Remir if it came to it. Not to mention a couple of upgrades he had in mind to help him elevate his alchemy to the next level. Okay. Far from perfect, but I think the mistakes are still in the acceptable range. He nodded once he was done, wiping some sweat off his forehead. Only the simple runes were left. If it hadn't been for this project of his, Percy might have considered it a waste of time to learn how to attach control runes to all his other enchantments. However, it was honestly good practice for what he wanted to accomplish. After all, the enchantments applied to a cauldron couldn't be used in their raw state. Each of them had to be modified with control runes, and not just one of them. The first control rune allowed an enchantment to be switched on or off, but it was possible to take that further by adding more of them. The second gave the enchantment 4 possible states, the third one 8 of them, and so on. Any decent cauldron, even the ones they had on Remir, needed to have its enchantments affixed with at least 4 or 5 control runes each. This was necessary in order to more delicately control the temperature and pressure of a concoction, which was exactly why Percy had even purchased the book on the cascading control enchantment. Sadly, He hadn't had the time to put its teachings to practice just yet. This would easily take a few more months. Still, he'd made sure he understood the underlying concepts well enough to work on this when he returned home. I'm feeling good about this attempt. He grinned once he finished drawing the final control rune. At least he hadn't run out of time. Enchantments. Preservation, concealment, hardness, absorption, control, memory, growth, heat, pressure, rotation, self-repair, controlled preservation, controlled concealment, controlled hardness, controlled absorption, controlled memory, controlled growth, controlled heat, controlled pressure, controlled rotation. Difficulty, 1.6. Runes drawn, 2,500. Time taken, 29,312 writs. Success rate, 60%. Score adjusted due to difficulty, 96%. Congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits, 300. Current balance, 529. This tale has been unlawfully lifted from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. Please tell me we're done with this crap forever. Noland pleaded. For the most part. Percy nodded, leaving it at that. Doing his best to ignore his thumping headache, he dragged himself to their supplies, fancying himself a handful of bugs, oddly enough. Or maybe he just wanted an excuse to move a little, his numb feet protesting every single step. To Noland's credit, he hadn't bothered him in the last 10 hours or so. A true achievement, considering how vocal the mole person had grown over the past few weeks. And Percy didn't exactly blame him for it either. The poor guy was probably bored out of his mind. I guess he just didn't want to risk ruining my attempt and forcing me to start over. At least they were done with runecrafting. Well, kinda. Ideally, Percy wanted to buy the index and skim through it once or twice, to give himself an idea of what was in there, just so that he could plan his future trips to the vault more efficiently. And maybe buy a rune for Nesha too. Sure, he could teach her some of the ones he knew, but he also wanted her to take another step towards crafting spatial amulets if possible. The darn things were becoming more and more important to them by the day. But neither of these tasks would take more than a couple of days. I should also check out the next wave's requirements for future reference. Draw any 30 runes 4,000 times in total in under 40,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual rune has to be drawn at least 100 times. He sighed, knowing this was the end of the road for now. Technically, he could draw over 50 enchantments if he dug into the cascading control runes, but he wouldn't be reaching an acceptable quality with those anytime soon. The only thing left for this trip are the combat challenges. If we do well in those, I can look into a yellow host next time. Obviously, Percy had already ran into diminishing returns in both the red and orange levels. His recent progress in runecrafting should be enough to get him past the 4th wave of the Red Magiscript Challenge, but that was a whole lot of work for a measly 120 credits. It was best to move to the next level when possible. Noland. As soon as you're done eating, we can give the Gauntlet Challenge a try. Finally, Percy shrugged. I hope those crystals are as good as advertised. Wave begins. May your challenge be successful. Noland's gaze was glued to the black tar pouring down the walls, rapidly filling the cube's floor. However, Percy didn't pay that much heed, having seen that a few too many times already. His attention was instead drawn to the spider-like golem speeding along the wall. The annoying little critter had already claimed his life once. Time for a rematch. He couldn't help but grin. Pulling some pure mana from his abdomen, he formed a short rod in his left hand, mostly to parry an attack or two with. Sadly, he couldn't reveal crystallization inside the vault, so there was only so much the new core could be used for. The rest, Noland would have to handle by himself. Just watch and learn. The mole person spoke with confidence. Drawing some of his gravity mana, he wrapped it around the orange crystal in his hand. A bombstone, he'd called it. The mana itself was quite weird, colorless and amorphous, yet pulsing with unquestionable might, waiting to be commanded into shape by its owner's will. Throwing his hand back, Noland tensed his muscles like a slingshot, as he focused even more mana in his palm. Of course, the golem wouldn't just let them do as they pleased. Detaching two of its legs, it sent them after them, trying to decapitate its challenger. Unfortunately for it, Percy had expected that, parrying the constructs away with the rod, giving his host a chance to complete his preparations. Not wasting another moment, Nolan snapped back, pitching the bombstone at a speed he could have never managed with brute strength alone. In an instant, the crystal landed right beside the golem before it had the chance to move an inch. Shattering, it bathed the room in a bright flash, accompanied by a booming shockwave that sent the tar's surface in turmoil. "I guess I'll need to work on my aim over the next couple of waves." He smiled wryly at the sight. However, Percy wasn't in a mood to chastise his host. He was a little busy trying to keep his jaw from dropping as he watched the golem's pieces slowly sinking into the dark liquid in several spots around the room. "Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits. 100. Current balance. 629. Wow! How many of those did we bring again?" He couldn't help but ask. Nolan's smile widened as he turned to look at the sack still propped against the wall. It was about as tall as he was, stuffed to the brim with crystals that threatened to spill out. "Plenty." Chapter 234, Bombstones. Overall, Percy and Nolan's setup was quite simple. That didn't make it any less effective, however. Using the pure mana to defend themselves, and the gravity mana solely to quickly deliver the explosive crystals to their opponents, they relied exclusively on the bombstones to take out the golems. Naturally, the constructs grew stronger with each wave, getting slightly larger and sporting an extra pair of detachable legs each time. There was no doubt in Percy's mind that they would have made for tough opponents had they faced them normally. Luckily, none of them survived their opening blow, though the third one nearly managed to leap out of the way in time. Not wanting to risk their life in the fourth wave, they decided to take a break from the Gauntlet Challenge at that point to give the Swarm Challenge a try. Suffice to say, the golems were even weaker there, the explosions often taking several of them out at once. Still, their sheer numbers had made it a little difficult for Percy and Nolan to hold their ground. Not to mention the strain they'd put on their limited supplies. By the time they cleared the third wave, their sack was already empty, finally putting an end to their cheating spree. Of course, the results were more than worth it. "Congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards." Percy's only regret was his inability to bring the bombstones back home. A couple of those would have made for an excellent trump card. Sadly, this was just the nature of his clones. Awarded credits. 300. Current balance. 1729. Wow! Words cannot express how glorious this is. Percy's mood instantly took a turn for the better, some tears welling up in his eyes. None of his previous visits to the vault had gone nearly this smoothly. Not only had he accomplished all his goals with time to spare, he even managed it without getting his body battered in the process. Suffice to say, it was with great glee that he finally purchased the rune index he'd been ogling for years, spending the next day studying it, much to his host's dismay. And he didn't stop there, also buying a book on shape runes for Nesha. By themselves, these runes could force a material to take on a fixed shape, in this case a cube. Combining them with the pocket, stability, and control runes, his girlfriend would have everything she needed to craft her first prototype of a spatial amulet after some practice. Well, assuming they found a suitable material for it. At any rate, it only took him another couple of days to memorize the new rune. This one didn't need space mana, even though he'd picked a variant that worked better with it. Percy could have easily learned to activate it too using his pure mana, though he didn't bother to do that. He didn't personally have a use for it, so he only needed to relay the symbol and the instructions to Nesha, and let her take it from there. About halfway through Percy's last week in the vault, he had already accomplished everything he'd set out to do, even having a little over 1,500 credits left to spend. Next time I should look into other stuff. Surely, the vault has more interesting things in stock than just Magiscript books. He decided. Up until now, he hadn't really had the option of branching out much. Other than the time he'd purchased the mana conversion spell, Percy had been forced to funnel all his funds into reading material to progress through the challenges. This was his first time having saved up a sizable sum. But not right now. I still have to digest my new gains. Besides, there was another reason he couldn't stay here any longer. Nolan's food was nearly exhausted, so Percy would have to start spending credits on that. His only option was to leave and dump the responsibility on Metatron. Now, who's the stingy one? Nolan asked. Fine. I admit this place is starting to influence me. Percy shrugged. Either way, he had one final stop before bidding him farewell. While he wasn't particularly worried about all the beasts he'd brought to the vault, Nolan was a sapient host. Even though their current arrangement was the result of a mutually beneficial transaction, Percy couldn't help but feel a little uneasy over leaving his new pal alone in this place. The tail has been illicitly lifted. Should you spot it on Amazon, report the violation. Consequently, he'd already decided to introduce him to Gabe. Not only would he catch up with his old pal in the process, but Gabe and Nolan would have each other to discuss their shared circumstances. Well, assuming Metatron allowed them. Percy? Is that you? Gabe asked upon opening his door. How can you tell? Gabe shrugged. Who else would visit me? Besides, you're the only one bringing random creatures here. Also, nobody else needs a translation device. Need I go on? Fair enough, Percy replied, extending his hand. This is Nolan. I found him stuck in an underground tunnel and offered to shine some light on his miserable existence. Nolan groaned internally over the joke, though he still took control of his body for long enough to shake Gabe's hand. I'm actually on my way out of the vault, but I figured I'd bring him here first. I'm hoping you could spend a couple of weeks teaching him the language, since he won't have the translation device after I'm gone. Percy added a second later. Gabe didn't seem particularly happy about it, though he ultimately agreed. At least, the system hadn't threatened them with a penalty this time. Apparently, the vault's language wasn't considered a restricted resource. This was probably because all the kids here learned it for free before they were even old enough to be subjected to the vault's brutal economy. I should put some effort into learning it too. Maybe I can sell the translation device back to the cube for a partial refund once I no longer need it, Percy thought. He'd slacked a little on it, preferring to focus on his other studies during the past couple of trips. Next, he proceeded to brief Gabe on Nolan's details, getting some information back from him in return. Apparently, his former host had made some progress of his own on Magiscript. In fact, he was a little further along than even Percy, largely due to devoting all of his free time on the subject. Sure, his missing eyes made it a little tougher, but Gabe had still made it work through mana sense alone. Are you going to try the challenge? Percy asked. Unless Metatron woke up feeling particularly generous one day, Gabe's only option was to get to the 6th wave of the Magiscript challenge and ask for life mana to restore his eyes. A rather ambitious project. Not yet. I think I could get through the first wave if I got lucky, but that's about it. The green level is much tougher than the ones you've tried, and it's not like I'm in need of credits just yet. He explained. Percy nodded in understanding. Logically, Gabe's current funds should last him long enough for his second core to reach green, and then at least another decade past that. Hopefully, that would be enough for him to fix his eyes. He'd need them before he could resume the combat challenges, and he'd need those to make it to blue. Anyway, he's got plenty of time. If it looks like it's not enough, I can offer Metatron something to help him out. Admittedly, the idea of handing the Callous Titan something precious made him sick to his stomach, but he wouldn't allow his friend to starve to death if he could prevent it. Normally, the Titan shouldn't let his most precious test subject to die like that, but he might be willing to do it if it meant putting more pressure on Percy to accept his terms. Either way, bringing another person here might have not been Percy's wisest move. His new buddy had grown on him, giving the powerful god another thing to blackmail him with. Don't even go there, Nolan said, Percy's thoughts having inadvertently spilled through their connection. You've made it very clear what sort of place this is. I came of my own volition, remember? I don't know what the future will hold, but the past few weeks have honestly been quite the exotic vacation. Whatever happens from here on out is none of your business. Percy sighed. He knew his host was right, but he couldn't absolve himself of all the responsibility. Then again, he couldn't afford to let such valuable opportunities pass. Had he brought a different orange host here, chances are he wouldn't have earned nearly as many credits this time. I hope you still feel this way the next time we meet. Maybe you can also negotiate with him how you want to be treated. Percy replied before elaborating. He doubted Metatron gave the beasts much of a choice in the matter, but perhaps he'd make an exception for Noland. Rather than placing him in a cage and experimenting on him directly, the Titan might be open to letting him live like Gabe, as a regular resident of the vault, completing challenges and earning his own credits. Then again, it was debatable whether that would be better, considering the man's lower grade. Either way, this was for Noland and Metatron to discuss. Bidding both men farewell, Percy stored the device before removing his soul from his host's wounds, allowing them to resume their recovery unobstructed. The pull from his main body instantly yanked him out of the vault in a familiar manner, having already grown rather powerful over the last couple of months. Drifting through the infinite darkness, Percy couldn't help but go over his latest gains, as well as the questionable price he'd paid for them. Eventually, he would have to make this right. Frankly, he'd already grown sick of having to tiptoe around the powerful, subjected to their whims, whether that was Metatron or the Divine Order. Sooner or later, I'll grow strong enough to see them eye to eye, to speak with them on my own terms, to voice my own demands. One day, Chapter 235, Trouble in Gentlebreeze Town. An overwhelming rush of memories flooded Percy's mind, bringing him to his knees. Noticing his soul wisp on the way back, he just about managed to put his brewing equipment away in time, to avoid breaking or spilling anything by accident. A good shout, considering how troublesome this clone was to assimilate. He wasn't necessarily the longest-lived one he'd ever sent out, but he'd spent months training non-stop, bringing a mountain of runecrafting knowledge back. Advanced knowledge that Percy now had to digest in an accelerated pace. At least I got what I wanted from the vault. He sighed a few minutes later, once he was back on his feet. His brain still pounded like a drum, and it would take him a few more days to fully wrap his head around the new runes, but he should be good for now. Fortunately, he was alone in the room, so he hadn't needlessly worried his companions. Nesha was busy mingling with the town's residents, trying to procure any alchemic reagents she could find in the local marketplace, hoping to extend Percy's dwindling stash. It was important, as he wouldn't be able to replace his Troll's Fury potion, nor continue to brew Aurora Dew without them. Of course, they were more likely to find what they needed when they reached their destination, but that was still a few weeks away. At least, Gentlebreeze Town was many times larger than Bogside Town. More developed too, with taller buildings, cleaner streets, and a bustling economy. Sure, commoners didn't live easy lives anywhere on Remier, but falling under the jurisdiction of a noble house that didn't treat them like cattle made a huge difference. Checking himself in the mirror, Percy couldn't help but frown as he rubbed his chin. Not quite there. He'd grown a bit of a stubble over the past couple of months, hoping it would help hide his identity when combined with his glowing eyes. It must have done something to that effect, since nobody had pulled him aside just yet. A rather important place to be, as he'd already spotted wanted posters of him and Nesha in multiple towns. Fortunately, the Divine Roots information was a little outdated, Baldy having done a great job keeping the news of his sorcerer's eye from spreading. Still, his disguise was incomplete. Ideally, he wanted to grow his hair longer too. Sadly, he'd have to wait another year or two for that. Then again, he shouldn't complain. The girls had it much worse, having had no choice but to cut their own hair short for the benefit of the group. And that wasn't the only sacrifice the others had made. Mickey had had a tough time traveling while skipping meals and conserving his stamina. They couldn't even bring him into the towns, so he was currently camping a few miles away. At least, his situation had improved a little. Pretty early on, they had discovered that the crow could use regulation with Percy's fused mana too, by absorbing it through his other mutations, his beak, talons, and eyes. Since then, he'd not only managed to clear his new channels, but he'd even learned how to split his ice mana into its components, regaining access to his other spells. Of course, he still had to find a use for the new affinities, and to finish tempering his pathways. Elaine was currently keeping him company, partly to protect him, and partly to teach him her circulation pattern. I should make it up to them. Technically, Percy was already pulling his weight in the group by providing everyone with Aurora Dew. But he wanted to do more for them if possible. Not necessarily for Nesha or Mickey. He'd already done plenty for both of them over the years. But certainly Elaine. After all, his cousin had risked everything to accompany them. Not to mention that she brought the most to the table merely by being with them, thanks to her high fighting strength. Naturally, he'd offered to teach her runecrafting like Nesha, but she declined. Her affinity wasn't particularly suited, and she didn't really have the patience for it either. The only other thing Percy could do for his companions was to grant them a second core. Strictly speaking, he'd already promised to do it for Nesha. Ideally, he would have liked to extend the favor to everyone, Baldy and Galahad included, but it just hadn't been possible. First, he didn't feel confident repairing a blue's damaged soul, let alone a violet's. Even for Elaine, he wouldn't dare risk it unless they had a green soul available for Mickey to eat. Then, he'd also had a clone active during his time back home, so possessing his relatives hadn't been an option. Reading on this site, this novel is published elsewhere. Support the author by seeking out the original. Much of that was solved right now, but they'd also need life mana to fix the decree. There wasn't much of a point in giving anybody the seed if they couldn't germinate it. All it would do would be to rob them of the ability to use healing potions. Sadly, they wouldn't be able to return to his family for the foreseeable future. Their only alternative were the green mushrooms, but they'd need way too many of them for this to work. I guess this is something we'll have to work on once we settle at our destination. The sheer number of corpses they'd have to procure was mind-boggling, but it wasn't like they had a better option. Either way, this wasn't that big a problem. As long as the divine root failed to discover them, everything else they could deal with. And it didn't seem like their enemies had any more karma users to send after them. I just hope Baldy is all right. He smiled bitterly. Percy had no way to contact his grandpa. While he'd done his best to draw Deimos's ire to himself, the guy didn't sound that reasonable. Percy could easily see him taking his anger out on House Avalon, especially considering that Jason had gone missing in the vicinity of their estate. Anybody who was unfamiliar with Percy's combat prowess would assume he'd had help taking down a green. Sadly, there wasn't much he could do about it, other than hope his grandpa was wise enough to handle the situation. Sighing, he walked out of the inn, deciding to take the rest of the day off. His headache would make brewing annoying, and he could use some fresh air. He also had to talk to Nesha about the new runes as some of them concerned her. Strolling down the street, Percy ignored the stares he got from the townsfolk. He was used to them by now, owing most of the attention he received to his eyes. Sure, the default assumption was that they were the result of his bloodline, but not many bloodlines were nearly this eye-catching. Heading towards the market, he soon noticed something strange, however. The place was always busy, but there were many more people around right now than when they'd first arrived in town. There seemed to be some kind of spectacle drawing everyone here. Shit. I hope Nesha hasn't landed in any trouble. Hurrying along, Percy pushed through the growing crowd, soon reaching the source of all the commotion. Luckily, he spotted his girlfriend standing a few rows away, not involved in whatever this was. Still, that did little to stop his face from paling. Several officials stood there, holding the commoners back, each of them sporting an elegant attire that Percy recognized all too well. Most notably, they were all adorned with insignias depicting some roots emerging from the underside of a cloud. And there were 5 of them, all of them at green. No! Did they find us already? Instinctively, he wanted to run away, but he held himself back, knowing that would be beyond foolish. Not only would he draw their attention even faster, there was no way he could possibly outrun 5 greens. Forcing himself to calm down, he realized something was off with the situation. Nesha hadn't tried to escape either, nor did she look very shaken. Besides, sending so many people after them was a bit much, wasn't it? It's just a coincidence. They must be here for something else. Exhaling a breath he hadn't even noticed he was holding, Percy allowed himself to relax. Next, he scanned the scene more carefully, trying to piece together what was happening. Other than the men of the Divine Root, there were two others standing there. Or, well, only one of them was standing, the other being on the ground. The first was a young boy. He couldn't have been older than 13, or maybe even 12. Yet, he looked as if he owned the whole town, his gaze brimming with uncontained arrogance. As for the other person, he was clearly distraught, groveling at the boy's feet, seemingly begging for something. He was much older too, a middle-aged man with a green core pulsing in his chest. He was clearly only an Orangeborn, but this was still a strange way to treat a green. At that level, one was already considered an elite, regardless of their birth grade. Why was the man kowtowing to the boy? Was he trying to apologize for something? Either way, the kid had to be quite important to have so many elites guarding him. Esteemed holy child, please, show mercy. Let alone the discount. I would have given you the trinket for free had I realized who you were, the man pleaded. But the boy didn't respond, merely kicking the man's face as if he was nothing more than trash. Nobody moved to stop him. Even the victim didn't bother resisting, letting the kid do as he pleased. Holy child! Percy's eyebrow shot up. He'd never expected to meet one in such a random place. But that would certainly explain the mess. Instinctively, his eyes fell back on the boy, this time scrutinizing him more carefully than before. Percy had previously ignored the kid, thinking he was only treated like this for being the son of somebody important. On further investigation, however, it appeared his clothes were even finer than the ones worn by the Divine Root. Somehow, they were adorned with all sorts of symbols Percy didn't recognize the meaning of. As for the boy's face, it wasn't anything special, his features as unassuming as his messy brown hair. It was only when he saw the brilliant blue core shining in the kid's sternum that Percy's eyes widened, the truth slamming into him like a battering ram. And if that wasn't proof enough, the suffocating domain he unleashed upon the crowd the very next second was plenty. Percy, too, felt the wind knocked out of his lungs as he finally accepted what the boy was. After all, there was only one sort of person who could possibly reach such a high grade this young. The very people the Divine Order recruited at any cost. The only ones who stood a chance of advancing past white. The ones who might one day become gods. The Greenborn. Chapter 236. Redacted. Percy quietly watched the scene unfold. His stomach churned as the boy practically tortured the poor guy, but he knew he couldn't get involved. Even if he banded together with all his companions, he'd never get past the Holy Child's guards, let alone the little monster himself. So, is this what a Greenborn looks like? He struggled to keep his nose from wrinkling. The overwhelming majority of people on Remir were born in the bottom 3 grades. Around 60% were Redborns, their lifespans capped in the low hundreds. Assuming wars didn't get to them first, of course. The highest grade they could hope to reach was yellow. Technically, Percy belonged in this category too, though his second core coupled with the Aurora Dew had boosted his future prospects to blue. As for his fighting strength, well, he was punching comfortably above his weight class, having already slain multiple Yellowborns his age. Then came the Orangeborns, who made about 30% of the population. People like Nesha and Orin belonged in this category, and they could even live a few thousand years if all the stars aligned. The highest grade they could hit was blue, much like Percy's mentor already had. That said, Nesha could potentially aim a little higher now, all thanks to him. Finally, there were the Yellowborns like Elaine, Galahad, or Baldy. Only 10% of the population was lucky enough to fall in this category, and they were considered the most valuable assets a noble house could have. After all, they were the only ones who could reach Violet after half a millennium, often coming to lead their families at that point. Very few houses had more than one Violet, and most of them were swiftly driven to extinction if they were unlucky enough to lose them all. Technically, they could reach white too, but only 7 Yellowborns were currently alive who had accomplished that. Yet, in the eyes of the Divine Order, the likes of Archibald weren't much different from Percy at the end of the day. Whether at red or white, all of them were destined to die as mortals, their candles snuffed in the blink of an eye. Even Theseus, The White Corps in charge of the Divine Root, one of the most powerful nobles on Remir, was nothing more than a failure in the gods' eyes. Somebody who wasn't deemed talented enough to join the Order's inner circle. That glory was reserved solely for the Greenborn. They emerged at much lower rates. Less than 1 in 10,000, in fact. The chosen ones who could achieve immortality. All of the Order's gods and demigods had been born at Green. Their titans too, by extension. Hermes, Phoebe, Iapetus, Kronos. Metatron and Svarog are probably the same. The ratios weren't exactly identical from one world to the next, but they usually fell within the same ballpark. It was no wonder that it was deemed impossible for a Redborn to reach godhood, considering how much lower their starting point was, but so few Greenborns existed, and only a fraction of them managed to ascend all the way. That was why each was considered a priceless asset. They could never be treated as regular nobles, nor could they be allowed to involve themselves in the pointless wars between houses. The moment a child was identified as a Greenborn, they were automatically sent to the Divine Order for training. As much as their families might have wanted to use them as weapons in their wars, there were few crimes on Remir more serious than secretly harboring a Greenborn, or allowing any harm to befall them. Rare as they were, many large, long-lived houses would eventually birth a couple of them. Still, they all understood the importance of complying with the Order's demands. Historically, only a handful of families had dared to risk it, all of them bringing calamity to their houses as a result. A case of theft. This story is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. At least, the Order was kind enough to give each family a minor treasure in exchange, as a small compensation for robbing them of such a talented child. From what Percy knew, the Jade Treebaldi used to hone his magic had been obtained in precisely this manner. No wonder they want the Aurora Dew recipe so badly, Percy sighed. The miraculous elixirs held the potential of turning Yellowborns into gods. Should that happen, the Order's ranks would climb steeply, changing Remir forever. After all, there were 1,000 times as many Yellowborns around as there were holy children. It would be harder for them to make it, of course, but it should still be enough to catapult their world to one of the leading factions in the universe given some time. That said, the first Yellowborns would need tens of thousands of years to reach godhood, so Percy hadn't done much harm by withholding the recipe for a couple of decades. Good luck explaining that to bastards like Hermes, though, he smiled bitterly. It wasn't really that surprising the Order's leaders were such eccentrics. Each of them had been taken from their family as a child, growing up without parents. They were all spoiled, being raised by others like them, never taught a shred of empathy or compassion. They were essentially given a crown from a young age, and left to do as they pleased. Thinking of that, Percy's gaze mellowed a little as he watched the boy torture the merchant. It was still cruel and inexcusable, but it wasn't solely the kid's fault. The system that created people like this was more to blame. Was this really the best way to keep their world safe? But he shook those concerns away for now. Either way, he didn't have the power to interfere just yet. Instead, he remained silent, clenching his fists as he observed the sickening scene before him. He might not be able to help the boy's victim, but he could at least try to learn a thing or two about his domain. It's really weak. He couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. While it had caught him by surprise at first, it wasn't that big a deal. Compared to Galahad's or the Starry Queen's, the boy's domain was gentle as a breeze, lacking any substance behind it. Not that strange, given his age. In fact, Percy would be surprised if the Holy Child had ever fought a real battle. Of course, this would change over time, as the boy progressed through his training as a candidate god. For now, though, he was a blue in name only. Percy wasn't sure if it was entirely due to the boy's inexperience, or if his training with Galahad had played a role, but he was confident he'd be able to move even without synchronization if he really tried. Still, the Holy Child would sense that, and things would only go downhill from there. Why did they even bring him here? Is he traveling to gain experience or something? Not that it was any of his business, of course. The only thing he wanted was for the boy to grow bored and leave of his own accord. Sadly, the place reeked of blood by the time that happened. The merchant was still alive, but he'd need a damn good healer if he wanted to walk again. As soon as the spectacle ended, Percy walked through the dispersing crowd, discreetly grabbing Nesha before leaving cautiously. It was only once they'd put some distance from the Holy Child's entourage that they hurried their steps, making their way back to the inn. "What should we do?" Nesha asked as they entered their room. "Originally, I wanted us to leave town tomorrow. We still have a lot of ground to cover. But I think we should lay low for a couple more days until those people are long gone. I'd rather not meet them on the road by accident." The girl nodded back in agreement. The good news was that she'd managed to buy a few crystal tulips from the merchants. Percy should be able to pacify the potion with those. Between alchemy and runecrafting, they'd have plenty of things to keep themselves busy as they waited. Not right now, though. His head was still killing him. He was about to lean for a quick nap when his familiar called to him. "Percy, are you busy?" At first, he panicked, his thoughts instantly wandering to the worst-case scenario. Had the Holy Child ran into Mickey and Elaine? But he calmed down once the crow explained this had nothing to do with that. Apparently, he'd made some progress with his ice magic. Furthermore, Elaine wanted to speak with him too, saying she had something to give him. After bringing Nesha up to speed, the two left town from a different side, heading towards the others. "I guess I'll be camping out tonight." Chapter 237. Ocarina. "Start by splitting them up," Elaine said. Following her instructions, Mickey spread his wings wide, channeling mana through them. Percy watched as two streams flowed from the crow's abdomen, each following a distinct set of channels. With a single flap, Mickey sent a harmless spray of water over Percy and Nesha, the droplets dancing playfully in the soft breeze. He still needs a lot of practice if he wants to use magic the traditional way, Elaine remarked. Mickey had always used his second core in tandem with his mutation, taking advantage of his glowing feathers to enhance his air affinity. Unfortunately, he hadn't developed any mutations to complement his new mana types yet, meaning he'd have to put in more effort to make them work effectively. "What about the ice affinity? Is that any good?" Nesha asked. "Better than the others, at least," Elaine said, before elaborating. "It doesn't need any preparation since it's technically his default affinity." Right on cue, Mickey gathered more mana into his wings, this time directing it through a third set of pathways. A thin layer of frost formed over his feathers. With a sharp flap, he sent a flurry of tiny ice shards toward Percy. They didn't carry much force, but the technique showed promise. "What about circulation?" he asked. Elaine shrugged. "His channels will be tempered in a few weeks, but I can only teach him the water pattern. He'll have to figure the ice one on his own." Percy nodded. That was about what he had expected. Neither he nor Mickey were novices. Given some time, he was confident the crow would get there by himself. With that settled, he brought Elaine and Mickey up to speed on the day's events, warning them to stay alert for any signs of the divine route. They were more likely to leave town via one of the roads than to stumble upon their remote lakeside camp, but there was no harm in being careful. "There was something else I wanted to talk to you about," Elaine said. Percy looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to continue. "I have a little gift for you, to make up for all the birthday presents you've missed over the years. I was planning to give it to you before you left the mansion, but with everything that happened, I completely forgot. I only remembered it today when I accidentally saw it in my spatial amulet." "Elaine, you didn't have to do that. Just having you here with us is more than enough," Percy said, feeling a pang of guilt. "Besides, I've missed all your birthdays too, and I didn't prepare anything for you." But his cousin just waved off his concern. "Are you kidding? You've been giving me free elixirs for months. I've already shaved half a year off my next promotion, and then there's circulation. I never even repaid you for that. Compared to all those things, this is just a cheap trinket." Percy sighed. He didn't agree with her assessment. As far as he was concerned, having somebody who genuinely cared for him throughout his childhood was worth more than anything. Everything else was just stuff. But he let it slide, knowing how stubborn his cousin could be. Oblivious to his thoughts, Elaine rummaged through her belongings before pulling a small object out of her amulet. It looked a lot like the pine cones from the Whistling Woods, though it was among the largest Percy had ever seen. Its shape was almost perfect, free of deformities or scars, at least, none that hadn't been placed there intentionally. Small holes dotted its surface in a careful pattern, one that looked strikingly familiar. "Is this what I think it is?" He raised an eyebrow. Elaine grinned. "I noticed you never got around to replacing your ocarina after gifting it to Owain. While I was staying with Mickey in the Whistling Woods, I had some free time and thought the cones would make a perfect material for one. The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident." Percy brought the instrument to his lips and blew a gentle note, listening carefully. The sound was remarkably similar to his old ocarina, though it also carried the nostalgic undertone of the woods. He spent the next couple of minutes experimenting, testing each hole one by one. "Wow! How did you get it to sound right?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "And all the holes are exactly where I'm used to." Elaine's smile widened. "I took note of the pattern from Owain's ocarina and made sure to punch the holes in the same spots." Percy remained skeptical. "And that was enough to make it sound right?" "Of course not," Elaine exclaimed. "The first one was awful. I went through hundreds of cones, experimenting with different hole sizes, until I got the sound just right." Percy felt a warmth spread through his chest. The ocarina itself wasn't anything flashy, but the sheer amount of effort Elaine had put into making it was staggering. She hadn't just made him a replacement. She had gone above and beyond, crafting something even better than the original. She'd clearly avoided many of the little girl's mistakes too. Every note was crisp, every hole perfectly placed. He turned the ocarina over in his hands, his fingers tracing the careful craftsmanship. "Thank you, Elaine. This means a lot." She shrugged, but there was a pleased glint in her eyes. "Just don't go gifting this one to the next toddler you meet, all right? I'm not making another one." Percy chuckled, but didn't say anything else. Calling everyone over, he sat by the lake's shore with his companions, dipping his feet in the water. Falling back, he relaxed on the cool grass, his eyes scanning the starlit sky above their heads. Placing the ocarina on his lips once more, he began playing, having missed the feeling a lot. The last time he'd had the chance to do this had been before Rambert's attack in the Grizzly Bog. At first, the tune was a little clunky as he was a bit rusty. However, he soon improved, recalling all the practice he'd put into the art. It was oddly soothing, the only skill he'd ever invested time into that didn't have anything to do with his magic or his combat prowess. But he'd stuck with it regardless, still trying to grasp the beautiful melody Mickey, the original Mickey, had played for him all those years ago. "I'm still a long way from that, aren't I?" He couldn't help but think. His friend had practiced for decades to get there. Not to mention that the kicklet was a vastly different instrument to his shoddy ocarina. Sporting 2 shafts and handled with 4 hands, it could play tunes no human was even capable of. But Percy didn't aim to recreate the whole thing. His goal was much more modest than that. Skipping the first part at the forefront of Mickey's performance, the uplifting melody a mother might play to cheer her child up, he instead focused on the other part, the deeper, more beautiful tune. It was a sad one, but the sound had touched his soul that day, remaining with him for years. This was what he'd tried so hard to recreate back in the swamp, with limited success. Still, his companions didn't complain, enjoying his music as he gave it another shot with his newly upgraded instrument. This hidden layer spoke of struggles against adversity, and of the fight for one's place in the world. Like a people cursed without an affinity, trying to protect their home. Or a boy born with a red core, looked down by all. Well, Mickey has plenty of affinities now, doesn't he? He has a new home too. And I've got quite a few people who don't look down on me anymore. Percy continued to play, getting closer and closer to that day's tune. Suddenly, he felt some emotions seep through the bond. Mickey's thoughts inadvertently spilling over. At first, it was just the cone's whistles reminding him of his time as a chick. But soon, the feelings grew deeper still, older still. Percy's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. But he didn't allow himself to stop, sinking deeper into the music. Mickey's emotions intensified as vivid memories began to accompany them. It started with flashes of the damp cell, the blood-stained arena. Those could have just as easily come from Percy. But more kept flowing through the cord as the crow started to lose control of his mana. Ice spilled forth from his abdomen, drawing the girl's attention. Percy nodded at them to calm them down, his focus returning to his familiar. A cold feeling spread through Percy's chest. Initially, he thought it was due to what Mickey was currently experiencing, the mana flooding his body. But the cold felt stronger than it should be, given Mickey's resistance to his own affinity. It was as if he was standing amidst a blizzard, hell-bent on freezing his very soul. Percy's fingers trembled, nearly missing a note or two, as the ethereal cord shook, clearly disturbed by something. The memories kept ramming into his mind, too fast for him to even retain, as a wave of worry began to sprout within him. This is starting to get dangerous. Maybe we should STO. But he didn't even get to the end of that thought when he suddenly lost control of his body. Everything around him turned dark, as a frigid wind blew against him, almost strong enough to lift him to the air. Instinctively, he dug his heels deeper in the snow. What the hell is going on? So unsettled was he, that he hadn't even registered he wasn't alone. That only changed when he felt something clench around his hand. Another person's hand. It was warm, comforting, familiar. Percy glanced at them. No, her. Trying to piece together her identity. It was a little difficult, given how dark their surroundings were, but he just about managed to make her face out, probably thanks to his yellow core. He recognized her too. Well, he didn't, but Mickey did. Sporting a long beak, shoulder-length black hair, and 2 pairs of arms, she stood a couple heads taller than he was. Mickey's mother. Chapter 238. Crimson Dawn. I can't control my body.
No.
Mickey's body. Percy realized. It wasn't that strange. This was probably a fixed memory, nothing like the clones he was used to creating. Everything Mickey was experiencing right now had already happened a long time ago. Giving up resistance, Percy allowed his body to move as it wanted to, focusing on gathering as much information as possible instead of fighting it. Obviously, this had to be Hue, but not as he remembered it. The complete absence of sunlight was odd, considering that the local star's location was supposedly fixed in place. Are we currently on the dark side? That would explain the cold. Mickey was doing relatively okay. He was still a child in this memory, but he was better dressed than Percy remembered him from their time together. His clothes were worn and full of holes, of course, but at least he did have a few layers on. More importantly, Mickey was a yellow-born, his body better suited to weather the elements. His mother was all right too. Sure, she was pale and haggard, probably due to hunger more than the cold, but she didn't seem to be in any immediate danger. Her orange core wasn't doing her any favors, but her adult body helped. It was the third person in their company that had it the worst. Percy only registered her presence when Mickey turned her way. His sister must have been a couple years older than him, but she was also an orange-born like their mother. Her face wasn't as thin as theirs. She was probably given more food than them, to better her odds. Still, she wasn't handling the cold as well. Not at all. She was shivering, her forehead adorned with frozen droplets of sweat. Her breath was rugged, wisps of silver escaping with each exhausted heave. I think we should take a break, Mickey's mother said in a foreign language, looking at her daughter with concern. The good news was that Percy understood her, likely because he was experiencing this through Mickey's perspective. Soon, everything around him faded, the splintered memory coming to an abrupt end. The next thing he saw was the snowy wall of an artificial cave, illuminated by a cyan orb floating in front of Mickey's mother. The 3 of them were huddled together inside the tight space, trying to keep each other warm. His sister, whose name neither he nor Mickey seemed capable of recalling, was munching on some frozen rations. As for the others, they were just watching her, probably having to fast due to the scarcity of their supplies. That was when Mickey's mother picked up an object from within her clothes. an object Percy identified.
Akikli.
Placing her beak inside the wide end, the woman blew a tired breath in it, as all 20 of her fingers brushed over the holes along its twin shafts. The familiar melody soon filled the small cave, bouncing off the cold walls. She's even better than Mickey was. Percy hadn't thought it possible, but the melody flowed more smoothly than the last time he'd heard it, the two tunes blending together seamlessly. Finally having a moment to think, countless questions swirled within Percy's mind. Why was this happening? Was Mickey about to regain his memories? Just how long had this woman practiced to get this good? But he shoved all of them aside, losing himself in the beautiful music. He didn't even register the passage of time until the memory broke off again, everyone skipping to the next scene. Mickey was walking with his family again, trudging through the darkness. The howling winds were loud enough to mask both the crunches of their steps and their rhythmic breaths. The good news was that the girl was doing a little better than before, the short break having helped. This story is posted elsewhere by the author. Help them out by reading the authentic version. Mother, how much longer until we reach the bright side? Percy asked, surprising himself. We're nearly there, the woman said before sighing. But don't get too excited. You know we can't stay there too long. As soon as your sister is better, we'll have to leave. The boy nodded as Percy pondered his mother's cryptic words. She hadn't said much, but he could piece a couple of things together thanks to what he already knew about Huehue. According to his understanding of this place, the bright side was entirely under their enemy's control. As for the dark side, it was scantly livable, especially for people at the lower grades. I guess families on the run have to spend their lives roaming near the border, juggling their time between the two sides depending on whether they're more pressed for warmth or cover. Percy couldn't tell if this was the same memory, or if he'd skipped ahead again. Mickey's sister was back to doing worse, and even his mother looked more gaunt. Mickey himself had grown tired, the cold seeping through his clothes, biting at his skin. Still, it was something else that captured his attention. A crimson glint pierced through the horizon, casting its dim light upon them. The light instantly illuminated their surroundings a little, allowing Percy to make them out. A plain of red snow stretched as far as his vision did. They weren't close enough for him to feel any warmth yet. The sunlight Huehue received wasn't that intense to begin with. Even the places directly underneath the star weren't very hot. But the tiniest difference might just be enough to save the girl's life. A small consolation, given how this ends. Percy would have sighed if he could. Mickey had already told him what had become of his family. Only he wasn't sure if it was days or years from now. Either way, the others hadn't a clue about that. So they just pressed onward with renewed vigor, their gazes locked on the eerie star. Suffice to say, Percy was more unsettled than they were, this being his first time watching such a strange sunrise. Yet its sheer beauty was undeniable. It was as if somebody had buried an enchanted ruby in the distance, the colossal gemstones slowly emerging from the snow with every step they took. A dawn governed by distance rather than time. When the memory next broke off, he found himself farther along the plain, the dim star having climbed a little higher. It was almost entirely above the horizon by now. The wind wasn't quite as cold as it had been, though the difference was barely noticeable. But that was the least of their problems. It wasn't just the three of them anymore. Standing a few paces ahead, a group of men looked at Mickey's family with unconcealed disdain. His mother was on her knees, seemingly pleading with them to spare her children. One of them stepped forth. Percy recognized him too. After all, he was the very person who'd ended this man's life. Mixcoatl. It was decades before they would meet. But, as a yellow-cord adult, his appearance wouldn't change that much. So, today's the day after all, isn't it? Percy wanted nothing more than to stop it, to spare his friend from reliving the tragedy. But there was nothing he could do. Everything was already set in stone. Oblivious to his thoughts, and unconcerned about the distraught mother's cries, Mixcoatl took one deep breath after another, flooding his body with mana. He manifested a couple of javelins in two of his hands, crossing the other pair of arms in front of his chest. By the time he reached them, the cyan lines had already lit up all over his body. Mickey followed suit, unwilling to take this without a fight. Percy noticed the boosting art helped a little with the cold enveloping them from outside, though circulation probably did more harm than good, all things considered. Their lungs protested as Mickey kept filling them with cold air, a wave of numbness spreading out of their chest. Still, the boy ignored the discomfort, rushing at the older man with a couple rods of his own, fully intent to lay his life down if he had to protect his loved ones. Mixcoatl merely cackled at the sight, however. He shattered Mickey's weapons with ease, the constructs not nearly as firm as they would eventually grow to be. "Leave this one alive. He'll make a fine gladiator," he said, kicking Mickey back to his companions. The men held him down, but Mickey didn't pay them any heed, struggling to lift his head up as he clawed against the snow. He raised his eyes just in time to watch the javelin pierce through both women with a sickening squelch, a splash of blood painting the snow an even deeper red. Neither of them let a sound out, sobbing quietly in each other's arms, tears rolling down their cheeks as more blood dripped from their beaks. "Noo!" Mickey screamed, but Noon cared. Noon but Percy. Percy wanted to console his friend, to promise him they'd chase Mixcoatl to the ends of the universe if they had to, that they wouldn't rest until he was dead. But he already was, and this memory wasn't any less painful for it. He felt the emptiness in Mickey's chest, as the boy's heart was torn out, the sting in his eyes as they welled with tears, the bitter lump nesting in his throat, the cold winds lashing against his skin, uncaring about his sorrow. The memory was just as vivid as the day it happened. And then, it was over. Chapter 239, Resonance. "Percy, are you okay?" Nesh's distraught voice was the first thing he caught. Prying his eyes open, he found himself back at the lakeside, resting on the same spot as before. Both girls were by his side, holding him in place, probably to stop him from hurting himself. The patch he lay on was now covered in more mud than grass, likely thanks to all his thrashing. His clothes were stuck to his back, caked in a layer of dirt and sweat. He nodded at his companions to calm them down, before turning his attention inwards. The next thing he noticed was that his mana was out of control, flowing randomly around his body. A lot of it was swirling aimlessly through his channels, in patterns vaguely reminiscent of synchronization. Yet the boosting art hadn't properly activated, due to a lack of mana and conscious control. Instead, much of it just spilled through his pores, slowly leaking out of his body. Reining it in took a couple of seconds. Well, most of it at least. Some got sucked by the ethereal cord in his chest. Stopping that seemed like too much trouble to be worth it at the moment. Wait! The cord! Mickey! Only then did he remember he wasn't in this alone. His familiar had been affected as much as he had. Gazing around, he soon spotted the crow a few meters away. Unlike him, however, Mickey didn't even twitch. He was encased in a thin layer of ice, reminiscent of a frozen statue. Percy's heart skipped a beat at the sight. Over the next minute or so, he repeatedly called to his familiar, trying to shake him awake. No response. Whatever the bird was experiencing had left him completely closed off to external stimuli. They could try breaking the ice forcefully, of course, but that was dangerous. It covered the bird's organs as much as it did its plumage. If they made a mistake, they could easily injure Mickey. The only safe option was to get him to thaw himself. "I guess I'll have to reach him through the cord." Easier said than done. The darn thing still oscillated like crazy, as if it was attached to a tsunami. Percy was hesitant to describe the cord in physical terms. For the most part, it was just a carrier for thoughts and memories. Still, he felt as if its width had more than doubled, stretched beyond its limits. Percy frowned. This wasn't the first time the cord was acting up in some manner, but it had never been this bad before. Usually, it happened whenever his clones encountered some trouble during their return trip. Why is it so much more intense this time? Was it because of his proximity to Mickey? Or the fact that the disturbance had affected both ends of the connection, rather than just the one? Either way, it didn't matter. He had to do something fast, lest the crow suffocated within its own construct. Instead of trying to stop the mana flow, Percy embraced it. He pushed more soul mana through the cord, sending his thoughts alongside it, hoping to jolt his familiar awake. "Come on, Mickey. Say something." The first pulse yielded nothing, but Percy didn't give up, trying it a second and a third time. This had to work somehow. If it failed, he didn't know what else to do. "Oh, caw!" The response came strained and weak. Mickey clearly wasn't in the mental space to articulate his thoughts properly. Still, this was a good sign. "Mickey, you need to calm your mana down. It's killing you," Percy said, sending another pulse through the cord. The ice mana in the crow's abdomen was out of control, much like Percy's had been a few minutes ago, though the bird clearly had it even worse. Percy waited a few moments, watching his familiar with bated breath. No reaction. The mana was still running rampant, showing no sign of stopping. He didn't know if the crow was having difficulty controlling it, or if he'd lost consciousness entirely again. Whatever the case was, they were swiftly running out of time. Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. I need to do more. Pulling more mana out of his core, he pushed it through their connection, trying to reach his familiar. Before his second core advanced to orange, his mind had inadvertently slipped into the crow's body multiple times. Maybe he could recreate that? A sound plan, in theory, but it wasn't working. No matter what he did, he appeared stuck in his own flesh, merely wasting his mana and his time for nothing. Almost out of options, Percy took a step back. Rather than sending his mind through the cord, he focused on the ice mana on the other side, trying to yank control of it from afar. A rather desperate move, admittedly. Neither he nor Mickey had ever accomplished anything of the sort. Their mana was generally their own, unless they volunteered it through their connection first. And that only worked with soul mana or its fused variant. They couldn't just reach out and forcefully grab the other's mana without their consent. Or can we? Well, it was going to have to work, as Percy couldn't think of anything else. Soon, a bunch of new complications arose. The fact that he'd never personally experienced the ice affinity wasn't helping. At least, he'd used water and air mana separately in the past. Percy focused on those memories. The times he had experienced intense cold might also make this easier. Like the memories he'd just watched with Mickey. Or the time he possessed that alien lizard all those years ago. For a while, nothing happened. But he didn't let that discourage him, pushing harder. Rather than his mana or his thoughts, Percy was trying to send his willpower through the cord. To forcefully attach it to Mickey's mana. Eventually, he got a reaction. It was faint at first, but he saw the flow change course inside Mickey's body ever so slightly. Perhaps it wasn't Percy's doing, but he had to believe it was. Anything else would spell Mickey's doom. Doubling down, he intensified his efforts, trying to think of Mickey's cores as his own. The crow's mana as nothing more than an instrument to his will. A soft cracking sound emerged, as a surface shard fell off Mickey's plumage. "It's working." Percy kept disturbing the mana flow, drawing it back to Mickey's abdomen. Whatever he failed to grab, he pushed outwards instead, expelling it from the bird's body. More cracks followed soon enough. Before long, the bird was able to breathe again, its emotions spilling over to Percy as it regained consciousness. "Wow, that's intense," Percy thought. His own relief was instantly suppressed by the crow's sorrow and confusion. A strange thing, considering that they'd long learned to keep their thoughts to themselves. Not that he blamed his friend for feeling this way, of course. Mickey had just watched his family getting butchered. A family that, until earlier that day, he hadn't even remembered. In any case, Percy was glad that the danger had passed, but they still had to do something about the cord. Kept shaking, drawing his mana against his will. It was also the reason for their emotions leaking through. Then again, it's not all bad. While they couldn't have it continue its rampage, the upsides of the transformation were undeniable. Percy hadn't thought about it much earlier, but his mana had flowed more easily, and in greater amounts than ever before. In fact, he was confident he wouldn't have managed to commandeer Mickey's ice mana if not for this. The song had been the trigger for more than the crow's memory. Whatever this power was, they couldn't afford to let it slip through their fingers. Percy sent another pulse, this time paying closer attention to the cord. The mana passed through it like a wave, briefly calming the connection down. This could work. Reaching out to Mickey, he navigated through the sea of tangled thoughts and raging emotions plaguing the both of them, explaining the situation. They had to work together to regain ownership of their bond. Percy, can you take a moment to explain what's going on? Elaine asked, having lost her patience. The gist of it is that we're trying to turn the accident into something beneficial for us. He replied succinctly. A longer explanation would have to wait. Activating synchronization properly this time, Percy gathered a lot of mana before sending it along in a dense packet. As soon as Mickey received it, he bounced it right back, in accordance to his earlier instructions. They kept going back and forth for over an hour, the cord calming down a little every time the mana passed through it. The influx of emotions also died down, as Percy and Mickey slowly managed to force the connection back under their control. Finally, it's done. He exhaled, allowing his boosting art to come undone. That said, there were plenty of things still begging for his attention. While Mickey had survived the ordeal, the crow's heart was still in turmoil. Percy had never really explained to him where he had come from, nor had the crow ever thought to ask. But there was no avoiding it any longer. A big conversation was clearly overdue. And then, there was the new power they had unlocked. The cord had calmed down, but it was still stronger than ever. Their thoughts and mana alike passed through it with no hindrance whatsoever. Not to mention the new ability of controlling each other's mana that they'd have to explore more carefully. For now, however, Percy was content just reading the notification. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Secret Art. Familiar, Crude-Secret Art. Soul Resonance, Refined. Chapter 240, Mickey's Choice. So, that four-armed boy in the vision, you're saying that was me? Mickey asked once everything had calmed down. Percy nodded. Evidently, his familiar hadn't truly regained his memories just yet. Not in any complete sense, at least. He'd merely experienced those scenes as an outside observer, much like Percy had. Still, the crow's time with his old family had inevitably sparked several questions. Percy proceeded to recount his experience on Huehue to help Mickey understand his origin. Elaine and Nesha also listened in, sitting quietly at the side. The former's expression remained unperturbed. It wasn't her first time hearing the story. Nesha, on the other hand, was a lot more curious. Percy had briefly explained how his familiar had been created, but not in detail. Now that we know it's possible for you to regain your memories, we can work on it together, Percy said upon concluding the explanation. But only if you want to. The earlier development was undeniable proof that the old Mickey was still buried in there somewhere, waiting to be dug out. After all, the flashback couldn't have popped out of thin air. But Percy's feelings on the matter were rather mixed. Had this been years ago, he'd have been ecstatic. This had all started with a rash and possibly misguided attempt to save his friend's life. At the time, he hadn't expected Mickey would lose all his memories, starting over from a blank slate. The guilt over that still gnawed at him to this day. Suffice to say, helping his friend regain his identity was something he'd wanted the whole time. Yet there was so much more to consider. The new Mickey wasn't just a young, oblivious bird anymore. He was essentially his own person by now. Smart, energetic, and fully capable of communication. Percy's closest family. Somebody he'd spent the better part of the last decade with. As much as he owed the old Mickey, he'd only spent a couple days with him by comparison. And he had no idea how the lost memories might affect his familiar. Percy had no intention of doing anything drastic without hearing the crow's opinion first. I'll do it. I want to remember. The bird replied after deliberating for a few minutes. Are you sure? I don't know how long it'll take, but there's no going back. The bird remained silent, its eyes glinting with determination. Percy sighed. He didn't know if this was the correct choice, but he understood where Mickey was coming from. His soul was made of 3 components. the stillborn birds, Percy's and the original Mickey's. The last one was arguably the most important part of his identity. After all, the bird had no memories or intelligence of its own, and Percy's soul would have only produced another clone if left by itself. Instead, it was the gladiator he owed his individuality to, or even the very reason for his existence. Naturally, Mickey wanted to know more about that person. Okay then, in addition to our other projects, we'll make some time for the ocarina. If we're lucky, it might jog another memory or two. And just like that, Percy's schedule got filled to the brim again. He hadn't even had a full day to digest his gains from the vault when all of this happened. Now he had a newly evolved secret art to explore, and to help his friend recover his memories. Not to mention that they were still traveling to the Thirsty Valley. Anyway, it's getting late. Why don't you guys head back to town? I'll stay with Mickey, he said. Is that wise? Elaine asked. Shouldn't one of us stay with each of you, in case your connection acts up again? Percy shook his head. The cord is currently under control, and we won't be doing any more dumb experiments tonight. We'll just sleep and take turns on guard duty. The author's content has been appropriated. Report any instances of this story on Amazon. Elaine was about to protest, but Nesha grabbed her hand, dragging her along. Come on. He's right. When was the last time you slept on a proper bed? Take advantage until we hit the road again. Percy felt a lot better come morning. His head still hurt a little, though not as much as yesterday. He could have used a few more hours of sleep, but he'd survive. At least nothing else had happened. The cord had reverted to its original state at some point while he was asleep. Still, he felt they could expand it again if they wanted without much effort. Looking at the empty space stretching between him and Mickey, who was currently perched on a nearby tree, he noticed something peculiar. A faint thin line was there, linking his chest to the crow's. Since when is the ethereal cord visible to the naked eye? He asked, though it didn't take a genius to guess the answer. On second thought, it shouldn't be visible to the naked eye, Percy. It was probably his mutation doing the heavy lifting, drawing from his status to make this possible. As for why he hadn't noticed it the night before, well, the darkness likely hadn't helped. His mind had also been occupied by other things too. At any rate, Percy was tempted to send some soul mana to Mickey to observe how the connection worked with his eyes. Sadly, he'd already promised Elaine not to do any experiments in her absence. Sighing, he resisted the urge. Calling Mickey over, he handed him some Aurora Dew, the two of them drinking their morning dose together. These are the last ones. We'll have to drink a regular elixir in the afternoon. It wasn't ideal, but Nesha hadn't found any suitable deattunement ingredients. Man, I really hope the Holy Child leaves today. We need to get a move on. The good news was that Nesha had bought several crystal tulips for him. He had more than enough to experiment to his heart's content, brewing multiple doses of Troll's Fury potion. He'd feel a lot safer with it too, the potion having already proven its worth against Jason. Over the next few minutes, Percy used the Morais technique to cleanse both of his cores, while setting his alchemy tools up. Mickey, make sure to warn me if you spot anybody coming this way. The sun was already at its apex when Elaine and Nesha came back, carrying some freshly baked bread with them. By now, Percy had finished brewing, a newly bought leather flask strapped to his waist. He'd filled it up with even more potion than he'd used the last time. And there was some left over too, which he'd stored in his amulet for a rainy day. You seem to be in a good mood, Nesha noted, handing him his lunch. I'll be in an even better one if you tell me the brat is gone, Percy replied, biting a steaming chunk off the bread. Afraid not, Elaine pitched in. Though we did hear a few rumors about him, we still have no idea how long they're staying here, but we do know where they're going. Same place as us. Percy nearly spat his food out, his face twisting into a grimace. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. Not that it was strange for a holy child to travel to the Thirsty Valley. That was precisely why that place even existed. But it was quite inconvenient for them. In theory, they could try rushing out today and hope the Greenborn's entourage never caught up. though he'd rather not risk it. Those people all had higher grades, so they probably traveled much faster than they did. Do you want to take a detour? It'll add a few weeks to our journey, but it might still be worth it if we leave now, Nesha suggested. Percy considered it. It wasn't a bad idea. Now that they knew where the kid was headed, leaving via a different route should be fine. All right, but we'll leave at night. Mickey should spend the rest of the afternoon using regulation to preserve his stamina for the trip. The crow didn't need to be told twice, or even once for that matter. He'd already activated his wild art the moment he saw Elaine and Nesha walking over. What should we do until then? Nesha asked. Percy handed her a piece of paper. He'd drawn her an example of the shape rune to practice on. Of course, the symbol itself wouldn't be enough to activate the enchantment. He'd have to share some additional insight with her over the coming days. Still, learning to draw the rune was a necessary step. It should keep her busy for a few hours. If you finish early, continue working on circulation. Meanwhile, I'll be sending out another clone. Now that I'm done with Rambert and the vault, I need to go back to spamming them every couple of days. As for Elaine, he flashed his cousin an apologetic expression. He didn't really have anything for her. She didn't seem to mind, however, waving his concern off with a chuckle. Don't worry about me. I've been working on a couple new spells of my own over the last couple of years. I guess it's as good a time as any to get back to that. And with that, everyone got started on their tasks. The Holy Child's presence had really messed their plans up, but hopefully they wouldn't have to worry about him after tonight.